All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our day 2 of OMNI. My name is Melina Sam. I'll be moderating today alongside Professor Sleeper.
Hi, welcome. My name is Christopher Sleeper. I'm the coordinator of the MiraCosta Honors Program, and I'm also a faculty member in the Department of History. I want to welcome you all to day 2 of our conference, 2 of 4 days. And each day has been going really, really well, so we're excited about today. A couple things that I want to just acknowledge is that we have also in our space here today, we have Parisa, and Parisa is one of our navigators. She's part of this session today. So I'm very grateful for Melina and Parisa, who have been amazing moderators for our sessions. And so I just want to say thank you for all that work that you've been doing and continue to do. Also, I want to do a shout out to Elizabeth Lorenana, and Elizabeth has been really the CEO behind the scenes for our conference. And so I just want to say thank you publicly for all the hard work that she's done, organizing these sessions, putting them and uploading them into YouTube and kind of making a virtual conference even possible. And so we have an amazing staff here at the MiraCosta Honors Program. And so I'm just so grateful to be with an amazing team of individuals who care so much and want to extend this opportunity for learning. So back to you, Melina. Let's have a great day.
Great. So we have 4 really amazing presentations today, but before we go ahead and get started, I want to go over some community expectations. So know that this is a safe space meant for learning. Practice patience with yourself and others. Speak from personal experience and avoid speaking for others. Give everyone a chance to speak. Never interrupt others. If you disagree with someone, ask questions to understand their intent or offer alternate interpretations, and don't repress others' perspectives. Treat everyone with respect, dignity, and kindness, and I know we'll do that, and these are recorded presentations, so it should go pretty smoothly. And if there are no questions, I'll go ahead and get started. Our first presentation is by Rolando Pineda. His mentor was Professor Christopher Sleeper. His title is The Juanita Community, an Experiment in Stricticulture. The Juanita community performed their first successful experiment in human genetics. So we'll go ahead and get started.
My name is Rolando Pineda, and my presentation is titled The Oneida Community, an Experiment in Stirpiculture. If we were to look up Oneida on Google, the first thing we would find is a reference to the silverware company Oneida Limited. From the surface, it looks like a regular company, and though it is not apparent at first, it actually has a very interesting history. Oneida Limited was actually founded in 1848, and it was known as the Oneida Community back then. Its founder was John Humphrey Noyes. The Oneida Community didn't start with making silverware. As a matter of fact, they started with making babies, but not just any kind of babies. They made super babies. In 1869, the Oneida Community carried out the first successful experiment in the breeding of humans in all of American history. The experiment was called stirpiculture. At its peak in 1878, the community reached a total of 306 members. So to carry out such a radical experiment like stirpiculture, they adopted radical beliefs such as Bible communism, complex marriage, and male continence. But in order to understand the Oneida community, we must understand who its founder was. So John Humphrey Noyes was born on September 3rd in 1811 in Vermont. He was raised by an agnostic father and a religious mother. He graduated from Dartmouth College in 1830, where he had studied law, but soon after found himself more interested in religion, so he decided to attend the Andover Theological Seminary and Yale Divinity School. When he was there, he became a follower of the revivalist movements, and he also developed a huge interest in Darwin's teachings. During his time at Yale, though, he made some radical assertions that were not popular and actually got him kicked out. And some of these assertions were that the second coming of Christ had already happened, and that at the time they were living already in the millennial kingdom. And perhaps the most serious assertion he made was that he himself had reached perfection. Consequently, he was denied ordination as a minister from Yale, so he left to Putney, Vermont, and he started preaching there. He attracted a handful of supporters and started a small community in which he implemented communal living and a small degree of complex marriage. Complex marriage was not popular at the time, and he was actually considered adultery. So on that basis, he was arrested on October 26th, 1847. But he was later released until his trial in April of the following year, and that's when he decided to leave to Oneida, New York, and that's where he founded the community. And it was in Oneida that his ideas were fully developed and practiced, beginning with Bible communism and complex marriage. Bible communism was the stepping stone for establishing a society in which the stirpe culture could be carried out. So Bible communism is a theological belief that Noyes and his followers adopted that led them to practice complex marriage. He argued that communism was experienced on the day of Pentecost, and though it only applied to material goods then, communism in the kingdom of God would extend into marriage as well. He argued that monogamy is a concept created by men, and that the human heart is capable of loving more than one person. He continued by stating that the bonds of marriage would then be abolished in God's kingdom, and that everyone would be married to each other. And here's a quote from the pamphlet that he published. In the kingdom of God, marriage does not exist. On the other hand, there is no proof in the Bible nor in reason that the distinction of sex will ever be abolished. The situation on the day of Pentecost shows the practical tendency of heavenly influences. All that believed were together, and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and parted them to all, as every man had need. Communism on the day of Pentecost extended only to goods, it is true, but the same spirit that abolished property in goods would, if allowed full scope, abolish property in persons. Paul expressly places property in goods and property in persons in the same category, and speaks of them together as ready to be abolished by the kingdom of God. The communism of the day of Pentecost is not to be regarded as temporary and circumstantial. The seed of heavenly unity fell into the earth and was buried for a time, but in the harvest at the second coming of Christ it was reproduced and became the universal, eternal principle of the invisible church. Thus, Bible communism would open the doors for complex marriage. Now, complex marriage is the practice in which every woman is married to every man, and every man is married to every woman. Males and females were seen as equal, and consequently, females enjoyed a lot more privileges and rights in the community than the typical woman in the United States at the time. The purpose of complex marriage was to enable members of the community to freely love whomever they wanted, but also to spread the divine energy within each individual through intercourse. Noyes believed that this divine energy was necessary to achieve perfection. To initiate a sexual interaction, a man would request what was known as a meeting with a woman, and then the woman would be free to accept or deny such request. If the woman accepted, they were free to engage in intercourse. Since marriage was communal, it was therefore discouraged to spend the night with someone after having had intercourse. They argued that that could lead to feelings of exclusivity and ownership. Communal living and complex marriage would later serve as means of selecting couples for selective breeding. But there was an increase in sexual activity in the community, so they needed a way to prevent undesired pregnancies, and that way was male continence. Male continence was critical for the development of the Oneida community, and without it, they would have not been able to successfully experiment with eugenics, since unwanted pregnancies could lead to the breeding of undesired genes. Male continence was a practice developed by Noyes after seeing the devastating pain pregnancy and the bearing of children brought to his daughter. The practice refers to the idea that men did not have to ejaculate to experiment the gratifications of sexual encounters, and that by not ejaculating, they would enable women the ability to fully enjoy sexual intercourse without the worry of pregnancy. The practice of male continence was rather uncommon at the time, and Noyes was heavily criticized by many for it. Nonetheless, it proved to be successful in the prevention of undesired pregnancies. To facilitate an introduction to this new way of seeing intercourse and male continence, Noyes proposed and implemented in the community a system in which young men, usually right after they reach puberty, would engage in sexual relations with older women, and young women, usually right after they reach puberty as well, would engage in sexual relations with older men. This would serve as a way of deterring the feelings of attachment sexual intercourse is usually associated with, and they would get them started at a young age. And also, Noyes thought that this would help in the spread of divinity by teaching self-control. At the core of Noyes' religious beliefs was the notion that humankind was on its way to become Christ-like perfects. But to achieve such perfection, it was imperative to carry out selective breeding, and thus stirpiculture was born as a result. Noyes became fascinated by Darwin's ideas of selective propagation in nature, and he soon made the connection that the same selective propagation would have to be carried out with mankind to achieve perfection. He then published an essay titled Essay on Scientific Propagation, and he made the following assertion. In perfecting animals, we attend to two things, blood and training, and we put blood first. But in the case of human beings, we have thus far left blood to take care of itself, and have given all of our attention to training. The duty of the human race to improve itself by intelligent procreation has certainly been seen in some dim way from the earliest ages. The analogy between breeding animals and breeding men is so obvious that it must have thrust itself upon the reflections of the wise, at least as long ago as when Jacob overreached Laban by cunningly managing the impregnation of his flocks. So during the early years of the experiments, Noyes himself was in charge. He believed that the most important characteristics in someone were spirituality, followed by intellect and physical attributes. This order of characteristics served as a screening feature for candidates that desired to have children. In order to be approved to procreate, candidates would submit a petition to Noyes, and then they would be screened by Noyes and the central members of the community to determine whether they met the desired level of spiritual, intellectual, and physical characteristics. If approved, Noyes and the central members of the community would find a partner that they thought would be a good match, and then they were free to procreate. On January 25th, 1875, they established what was called a Stirpicultural Committee, and it was composed of 6 men and 6 women. The selection process was very similar to the way it was before. A couple would submit an application, and the committee would either approve or disapprove. However, if the committee disapproved, they would attempt to find a suitable combination for the applicants, and they would also initiate the creation of combinations that they thought would be especially fit for having children. Ultimately, 81 parents were chosen and 58 children were born as a result. Here on the left, we have a picture of what was known as stirpicultural children. Obviously, these are examples of the experiments, but to gain a greater insight on the success of stirpiculture, Noyes' nephew, George Wallingford Noyes, and his wife, Hilda Herrick Noyes, actually did some research, and these are some of the facts that they published. First, no mothers were lost during the experiment, nor indeed during the entire career of the community from causes directly or indirectly due to childbirth. Second, no deaf and dumb, blind, crippled, or idiotic children were ever born into the community. To this day, there are a lot of descendants from stirpicultural children, and even from Noyes himself, but the community doesn't exist anymore. What led to the downfall of the community was the deviation from their foundational religious beliefs. Noyes had to leave to Canada because he was being persecuted by law enforcement on charges of child abuse and also adultery. So he left his son in charge. His son was agnostic and lacked the spirituality that Noyes possessed. Without spiritual strength, he wasn't able to gather support from the members of the community, and an internal power struggle began. Ultimately, members decided to disband the community and form a stock joint company. An argument can be made that they split up not because of religious leadership or the lack thereof, but because of an internal economical disagreement. However, when we examine how deeply the community members felt about their religious beliefs, we can see that really this was a predominant cause in the split. So this is a statement made by some of the young women of the community addressed to Noyes, in which they say, that we do not belong to ourselves in any respect, but that we do not belong first to God, and second to Mr. Noyes as God's true representative, that we have no rights or personal feelings in regard to childbearing, which shall in the least degree oppose or embarrass him in his choice of scientific combinations, that we will put aside all envy, childishness, and self-seeking, and rejoice with those who are chosen candidates, that we will, if necessary, become martyrs to science, and cheerfully resign all desire to become mothers, if for any reason Mr. Noyes deem us unfit material for propagation. Above all, we offer ourselves living sacrifices to God and true communism, signed by 53 young women. Here's another example, and this is signed by the young men of the community. The undesigned desire you may feel that we most heartily sympathize with your purpose in regard to scientific propagation, and offer ourselves to be used in forming any combinations that may seem to you desirable. We claim no rights, we ask no privileges, we desire to be servants of the truth, with a prayer that the grace of God will help us in this resolution. We are your true soldiers, signed by 38 young men. In these two statements, we can contemplate the deep devotion they had. Their devotion to God is admirable, and is a major driving force of their admiration of Noyes as a servant of God. Without having a leader that could inspire such deep devotion to religion and medical radical practices, it is easy to see how disagreements would arise, and therefore it is not surprising that they ended up splitting. The United Community now serves an example of how religion can play a significant role in society. When leaders use religion, they can motivate many to adopt radical beliefs that can also develop loyal supporters. This pattern can be observed in modern-day Christianity and its other denominations, such as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, founded by Joseph Smith and still growing to this day, even extended to the rest of the world. So when you are sitting down for Christmas dinner or Thanksgiving dinner, and if you see silverware, remember the origins of Oneida silverware.
Hi, everyone.
Sorry, but that was a great presentation. There will be no live Q&A for that presentation. So if we're all good, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next presentation. The next one is by Chiara Von Clev, and she'll be discussing Breaking Out of the Cult of Domesticity. This essay explores the lives of women during the antebellum period via the cult of domesticity, the public and private sphere, and the Republican motherhood, and her mentor was Professor Sleeper.
My name is Chiara Van Cleave, and my research is about the cult of domesticity. This project goes through and looks back on all of the groundwork that 19th century American women did for early feminism, women's rights, and paving the road to Seneca Falls. During the 19th century, white American women were second-class citizens to men. Even after the United States was established, little changed for women politically or socially. They were forced to stand behind them and to only perform what was deemed as womanly duties. If women were to ever engage in the political or social bubble that men held all power to, there were many conditions and they were not free to exist publicly. Before women agitated for equal freedoms at Seneca Falls, women had to first push out of their accepted social and economic barriers that both existed in the cult of domesticity after the American Revolution. The public and private spheres during the 1800s differentiated the roles between men and women in society. In the 19th century, society was split into two spheres, the public and the private. Gender-specific associations were being made of the public and private spheres. The public sphere was essentially just for men. This male-dominated space included the workforce, from factory work to farming, work in law and medicine, and political work, all of which women had no place in. Women were forced into the private sphere by men. Their sphere was defined by domestic duties, including taking care of the children and keeping the home in order. There was a clear separation of gender roles economically, socially, and religiously in the new republic of this time. There were many restraints put in place against women that limited what they could do throughout their day and in society. It was imposed upon them that their role in society was to be in the private sphere rather than the public. 19th century feminist political theorist Frances Trollope pointed out in her travels in America that, quote, women have never been completely excluded from participation in the public world, but women have been incorporated into public life in a different manner from men, end quote. Women never experienced having a specific role or duty in the public sphere. Rather, whatever place they held in the public sphere was to be there to support their husbands, and if they had done anything worthy of noting, they were never recognized. For example, women had a large supporting role during the Revolutionary War. They cooked, sewed, cleaned soldiers' uniforms and clothes, provided medical care for soldiers as nurses, and some even spied on the enemy. Yet these acts were never recognized by men after the war, and women were still stuck in the private sphere. Historian Carl Becker proposed the question, quote, was the revolution really a revolution, or was it merely a change of regime, end quote. The power from the British monarchy dictating American people transferred into the power of men over women. The Revolutionary War did not end in freedom for women like it did for men. So now let's look at Republican motherhood. The term Republican motherhood was coined during this time, and it represented the woman's role as a mother in the private sphere during the 19th century. Republican motherhood highlighted the duties of women for the good of the public, which was through encouraging their husbands' duties for the public and teaching their children, specifically sons because they would be the ones to impact the nation's future, about the values of being a good citizen. These were duties that women would already be practicing in their private sphere, but because they were deemed significant for the good of the public, they suddenly mattered in society. This was some sort of progress from man's long-believed impression that women offered nothing of importance for the public, but it was by no means an accomplishment of equality. Historian Linda Courbet wrote, quote, the political traditions on which American politics were built offered little assistance in defining the point at which the woman's private domain intersected with the public one. The Republican mother seemed to offer a solution, end quote. Although it was confining and limited, the Republican motherhood did obtain a sliver of involvement into the public sphere for women. However, it was not based on their own merits or accomplishments, but due to them helping and teaching their sons and husbands that granted them that access. Okay, so now moving into the cult of domesticity. Looking at the antebellum period, which was the period after the War of 1812 and before the Civil War, women were forced into what has been defined as the cult of domesticity, which was the new ideal of womanhood and home values at the time. The cult of domesticity laid out what society declared as gender roles in 19th century America. Men went to work in and with the public, while women were expected to stay in the home and to exhibit four main characteristics that essentially made up what it meant to be a woman. The main aspects include piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. The first aspect is piety. It was believed that women would be guided by their faith in God to lead a domestic and submissive life to their husbands. Focusing on religion was a topic to occupy their minds while at home, as it kept their minds from straying away from the household. Women who were not religiously devoted were considered to be unwomanly and not good mothers in this new era. What their religion laid out was what they followed in their daily lives, which encompassed familial matters. Women were expected to have strong religious devotion and to regard their religion within everything they did. During this time, society thought of women to be responsible for repenting others' sins and fixing the world of sin through undergoing her own personal misery. This even included a woman not gaining anything she would like from sexual acts, and instead only experiencing unemotional love from her husband. The second aspect is purity. Purity also kept women in the home, as non-virgin women were looked down upon, unlikely and unworthy to be wed, and were regarded very unkindly in society. Women who saved their virginity were on track to be married, as it was how they gave themselves away to their husbands. Unfortunately, losing their virginity to their husbands gave the man ownership over her. Some in society even viewed women's purity as their power because they could control men with it, and through being thoughtful with her virtue, she could maybe persuade men with the possibility of taking her virginity. This would have been a problem for the man's ego because he would have lost all power in the situation. Losing one's purity as well as the thought of the wedding night could be a confusing and stressful process for women. All their lives they'd been taught how pure and important their virginity was and how to keep their innocence, and now they were losing it. Women were even told how to avoid men and the possibility of losing their purity before marriage so that they would stay intact for their future husbands. By essentially giving it to their husbands, women became completely dependent on them, as it gave their husbands a sense of control over her. The obsession with purity during this time also brought on many terms and myths in order to avoid referring to the female anatomy, and some of which are still present in today's society. For example, instead of saying breast meat, society started to refer to it as white meat so as not to bring any attention to women's breasts. Also, the myth that babies come from storks became very popularized during this time as a way to avoid saying that babies came from women. The third aspect is submissiveness. With giving their purity to their husbands, women entered into the act of being submissive. Like women, although not as extreme, men were expected to be religious and hold some sense of innocence. However, men were never to show any type of submissive behavior. That would be considered completely unmanly and either put men and women on the same playing field or make them lose some of the power they held over women. Men were supposed to be strong, accomplished, and active in their roles in the public sphere. Meanwhile, women were supposed to be silent observers, surrendering to their life in the private sphere, to their religion, and to their husbands. Men ensured a woman's submissiveness through a variety of ways, but today we'll be looking at how they dictated how women dressed. Women were told to dress in such a way that limited their mobility. As you can see from the photos, these dresses are huge. They include layer upon layer of fabric and a very tight corset. This type of clothing was extremely heavy and very hard to walk in. This proved a woman's submissiveness because she was supposed to feel weak by it, although she was already thought of as weak, and it taught her to have to depend on men to help her and to make her want a strong man to do what she could not, because she was so restricted by this clothing. It was expected for a woman to be and feel inferior in a man's world. Times were sometimes uncertain for men in the public sphere, and they relied on the consistency of having their submissive wife to come home to every day. Being submissive, of course, only further perpetuated sexist beliefs about women, such as their weakness, their place in the home, and needing a knight in shining armor to save her. The fourth and final aspect is domesticity. Ultimately, women were expected to be in the home and to focus on family life, and to only practice what was in the realms of domesticity, which could be defined as being a housewife. For some women, following the aspects within the cult of domesticity was so important to the role of being a woman that some even wrote different types of literature about it to encourage and help other women to maintain their role of true womanhood well. The magazine Godey's Lady Book taught women that housework was important and to take care of their husbands and children. It even listed activities and tasks that were deemed acceptable and appropriate, like needlework, keeping a peaceful household, and childcare. These were considered acceptable because they were all able to be accomplished within the home. A woman's job was to keep peace in the home so that the husband had a nice environment to come home to after a long day at work. She had to make sure that all of her family's needs were taken care of. This was essentially the blueprint of life that women of the 19th century were predisposed to follow to lead a successfully submissive and domestic life under men. In antebellum America, society was divided into public and private spheres, and the ideologies of Republican motherhood and the cult of domesticity were expected to be followed. Some women gained the strength to inspire others to break out of their specified gender roles that were assigned during the 19th century in an effort to work their way out of the cult of domesticity. This was definitely not an easy accomplishment, as gender roles were pretty cemented and men, as well as some women, were deeply opposed to women joining the public sphere. These strong women overcame the oppressed lives that were mandatory for women and led others to join the groundwork that would lead to the women's movement in the future. Such women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott started real change, like with the Seneca Falls Convention. These two women gave others the space and opportunity to share their voices and opinions after being excluded and rejected from public life for so long. Here they wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, which showcased how suppressed women were from the public sphere and expressed their wants and needs for change. The Seneca Falls Convention could be considered the first wave of feminism, which allowed women to start inciting change for the betterment of their livelihoods. The women of the 19th century, specifically the antebellum period, started what the women of the 20th century fought for so that women of modern-day society would have a place and a voice within the public and the political patriarchy. They made the strides for women to have rights and made it possible for even today's women to speak up and fight against misogynistic practices. Here are the sources I used if you would like to look into anything to satisfy your own curiosity. Thank you for your time, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you to Kiara. That was a very detailed presentation. There will also be no, yes, a round of applause to her. There will also be no live Q&A for this one. But I believe Professor Sleeper would like to add something to the presentation.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of great videos this week, and just wanted to let everyone know, if you happen to miss a video or a session, we're going to be having all of these made public after our presentation, after this week of OMNI is over. So by early next week, we'll have all of these live, and you can go and use them and see them and learn from them and share with them for others. Also, I want to make sure that it's in the recording that if you're interested in presenting at a research conference, we have our OMNI every semester. It's at the end of each semester, and we would love for everyone to participate. And then also that we have a deadline coming up for our spring research conferences. The UC Irvine HTCC Research Conference is the deadline's coming up for that. And so if you have a student that is interested, or as a student you would like to participate, it's a great year. It's going to be just like our OMNI. And so it's going to be full of pre-recorded presentations. It will have a live Q&A though. It's going to be taking place over 3 days, March 25th through the 27th. And so if you're interested, please get in contact with me by emailing me at honors@miracosta.edu. And that deadline's coming up by December 18th. So it's just amazing to see how these videos and presentations come together. I'm so grateful for the support. I know I'm listed as the mentor for Kiara's, but also Rolando's, but also we had other faculty that helped us in this, develop these presentations. And that faculty member was Leslie Doig, a full-time faculty member in the history department. So we're so grateful to have everyone participate. Parisa, why don't you, you just put something into the chat. Why don't you kind of explain a little bit, and then we'll turn it back to Melina.
Oh, yes, of course. I just provided the link in the chat, and it's a link to these commentary forms, which as audience members, it would be very much appreciated if you could please go to that link and use the form to provide feedback to the presenters that we're watching. You will be giving them a little score based on what you think and additional feedback for them. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Melina, great job. Take it away.
Yes, thank you to the both of you, and thank you, Parisa. Yeah, that'll be very beneficial if you fill out that form, since a few of the presenters aren't here today. But we'll go ahead and get started on the third presentation by Austin Quant. His presentation is titled Withholding Dissent, the Supreme Court During the Progressive Era. In the following presentation, Austin will explore why the Supreme Court frequently ruled against progressive social and economic policies during the Progressive Era, and his mentor was Professor Lisa Lane.
Withholding Dissent, the Supreme Court During the Progressive Era by Austin Quant, mentor Professor Lisa Lane. During the late 19th century and early 20th century, the United States was in the progressive era, in which there is an increase of social activism along with economic and political reform. The way the government and politics function changed in this era, and therefore, new progressive legislation frequently passed across the country on all levels of government. However, when the legitimacy of progressive legislation was tried by the Supreme Court during this era, the court frequently voted against upholding these policies. During the progressive era, the Supreme Court rejected progressive social and economic policies because the majority of the court had an originalist, activist-leaning ideology. The progressive era is a period in American history which begins in the late 19th century and lasts through the early 20th century. During this era, there is an increase in social, economic, and political activism that sought reform of the already existing structures within society. The increase in activism occurred due to problems caused by industrialization, political corruption, and urbanization. Due to the increased desire for rapid change of society, historians often refer to this time period as the progressive era. According to the Constitution, the Supreme Court has the power vested in it to determine if a law is considered constitutionally legal, that is, whether the Constitution would allow such a law to be enacted and enforced, and whether the legislative body that passed the law had the power to do so. As a result, the Supreme Court has the ability to permit or deny laws that are passed through the process of hearing and trying cases. The Supreme Court ruled against progressive social and economic legislation due to the majority of the justices applying the practice of textualism. Textualism is a judicial philosophy and practice in which the judge applies the original meaning of a text to the case. The U.S. Constitution implies that all U.S. citizens have rights to general welfare and protected fundamental rights. General welfare is the idea that the government must protect the freedom and liberty of the citizens. Fundamental rights are rights viewed by the government as needing high protection, such as the right against exploitation. A defining case during the progressive era was the case Launcher v. New York, which occurred in 1905. During this case, the Supreme Court ruled that states could not set time limits of working for workers. In the opinion of the court, Justice Peckham describes how the right to general welfare is attacked when he writes, "The statute necessarily interferes with the right of contract between the employer and employees concerning the number of hours in which the latter may labor in the bakery of the employer, which signals that the law to limit the amount of time workers can spend working was considered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court." In this example, the court views the general welfare right as the freedom for the individual to make a contract with their employer, as well as having the liberty to choose how much time they work. The court determined that the fundamental right of the government to protect the worker from exploitation does not overrule the general welfare right. The justices believe that the general welfare of the individual was of greater value in the Constitution. Therefore, they did not try to apply the Constitution in modern terms or try to determine if there was an example in which the Constitution could do more harm to the people, such as workers being forced to work excessive hours, in which the fundamental rights of the individual would be insulted. They strictly followed their ideology of examining the Constitution the way it was written. In the case Adar v. the United States, which occurred in 1914, the court ruled that bans on yellow dogs contracts, which forbid workers from joining unions, were unconstitutional. In the opinion of the court, Justice Harlan describes how the freedom of contract under general welfare rights extends to the sale of an individual's labor when he writes, "Such liberty and right embrace the right to make contracts for the purchase of the labor of others, and equally the right to make contracts for the sale of one's own labor. The court again used a close interpretation of the meaning of the Constitution to make the decision that banning yellow dog contracts would interfere on an individual's right to contract, therefore making the law unconstitutional. However, the court does not look at the circumstances of modern society, in which forbidding workers from joining unions could deprive the individuals from having protected fundamental rights. The court focuses on upholding the Constitution the way in which it was written, and applying that strict meaning to society during the Progressive Era. The 14th Amendment was also used as the basis to reject progressive legislation by the Supreme Court. This amendment was established in 1868 and declared that every citizen should be given equal protection under the law. In the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, the court ruled that it was legally constitutional for there to be racial discrimination laws so long as segregated places were equal in quality. Justice Brown, who gave the opinion of the court, stated that the 14th Amendment permitted discrimination when he writes, The object of the amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law, but in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality or a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either. This highlights that the majority of the justices applied the original intention of the 14th Amendment to the case. They viewed the 14th Amendment through the lens it was written to help end slavery and create more equality in the United States, while at the same time failing to address the end of segregation. Due to the justices' ideology, the court chose to interpret the 14th Amendment in the manner in which it was written and applied that meaning to the case. Therefore, the justices did not see there being a legal problem with segregation and permitted the discrimination laws to remain in place. In the article, A Tale of Two Launchers, The Untold History of Substantive Due Process and the Idea of Fundamental Rights, author Victoria North describes how the Supreme Court favored rights to freedom, which she states, during the Progressive Era, courts assumed general welfare rights existed prior to any written constitution, and enumeration was no grand ideal rights, were defined negatively by drawing limits on federal and state power. North illustrates how during this era many legal scholars and justices thought that general welfare rights to liberty and freedom were naturally awarded just by living. However, these rights to freedom were sometimes infringed upon while trying to ensure that everyone had fundamental rights, which allowed people to have a better quality of life living in society. The justices viewed the Constitution in the context for which it was written, which was following a war fought for freedom. A lot of progressive legislation tried to use government regulation in order to protect the people. However, the justices saw this as a violation of the Constitution, which upheld the individual's right to liberty. They did not try to apply the new needs of society, rather examining only the original meaning of the Constitution, causing them to rule in favor of freedom rights. The Supreme Court during the Progressive Era ruled against progressive policies because the court used conservative judicial activism. Judicial activism is the practice of choosing to hear and try cases involving laws passed by Congress or the President, along with striking down laws passed by Congress or the President. In the court case, Hammer v. Dagenhart, which took place in 1918, the Supreme Court ruled that a federal law regulating child labor was unconstitutional. In the opinion of the court, Justice Day describes how the law is invalid due to Congress not having the power to streamline economic policies when he writes, "There is no power vested in Congress to require the states to exercise their police power so as to prevent possible unfair competition." This depicts how the court took the opinion that they should follow and applied judicial review in their decisions. The court applied the idea that this law should be struck down because Congress could not create a certain economic policy which was creating restrictions on minors in the workforce, which would apply to every state. At the time the law was written, each state had different rules of minors in the workplace, while this law would create a nationwide law on the subject. The court chose to pick apart one part of the law instead of focusing on the overall purpose of the law, and in their opinion, found a reason for it to be considered unconstitutional. Given that this law was intended to protect minors, a Supreme Court which was practicing judicial restraint would have looked at the whole law and likely would have allowed it to remain intact. However, since the majority of the justices had a conservative ideology, they were actively looking to strike down laws which did not follow their ideology for any given reason. This idea is also expanded in the case Pollock versus Farmers, which occurred in 1895. In this case, the Supreme Court found the income tax imposed by the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act to be unconstitutional. In the opinion of the court, Justice Fuller uses the idea of taxation without representation to detail why the law is unconstitutional when he states, "Nothing can be clearer than that what the Constitution intended to guard against was the exercise by the general government of the power of directly taxing persons and property within any state through a majority made up of other states." The justices are arguing that this law is not constitutionally acceptable because Congress is composed of members from every state, and each state has its right to not be taxed without representation. According to this argument, smaller states may not have as much representation in Congress, and therefore should not be forced to follow the tax laws set. The Supreme Court looked at this case through an originalist point of view, and therefore felt that Congress was conducting taxation without representation, which they saw as a breach of Congress's power. This represents how the Supreme Court challenged the power that Congress has in order to keep progressive policies from being established in this country. The court used their vested power to declare laws unconstitutional because they wanted to control the path the nation was going on. In the article, The Supreme Court, 1888 to 1940, an empirical overview, authors Sandra Wood, Keith Linda, Lena Drew, and Ogundele Ayu write about patterns which occurred in the Supreme Court during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The authors describe how David Curry once noted that in the Progressive Era Supreme Court, activism protecting economic interests contrasts sharply with the judicial restraint of its predecessors. This illustrates how the Supreme Court during the Progressive Era had used their power to declare more laws unconstitutional than prior courts. It was not normal for the Supreme Court to be actively striking down so many laws that the elected legislative body was enacting. The Supreme Court had a pattern of taking parts of laws of progressive economic and social policies and declaring them unconstitutional without looking at the intent of the whole law or how the law could be applied legally within the new needs of society. The court increased the practice of judicial review to check the constitutional legitimacy of progressive laws that were being voted into law by Congress. Progressive policies during this era aimed at transforming the social and economic system. The Supreme Court during the Progressive Era ruled against progressive legislation because the court wanted to ensure social stability in the United States. In the article, Anti-Canonizing Courts, the author Jamal Green describes how in order to understand why the Supreme Court voted against progressive legislation, people should know that the culture that those judges are part underlies actions we now believe to be unethical or immoral. Green is trying to depict that society in the late 19th and early 20th century was very different from modern society. As a result, society was not as equal as it is today, and therefore changes in social and economic legislation aimed at bringing more justice often received more of a polarized reaction. Since the justices on the court had a conservative ideology, they were not looking for change in society and wanted to keep social structures the way they were. Even if the majority of the general population had voted in members of Congress who supported progressive legislation, the court was not afraid to use the practice of judicial activism to ensure social stability. In the case Plessy v. Ferguson, the court used the idea of anti-social structural change in the decision to not end segregation. In the photo, Ku Klux Klan, which was taken in 1921, the photograph depicts people with white sheets draped over them, presumably members of the Ku Klux Klan. This image illustrates how during the Progressive era, people were still very racist and against social change. Since the justices on the Supreme Court tended to have more conservative values, they took advantage of the fact that society was in a different time period. However, this disregarded the changing attitudes of the majority of the general public. This idea about ensuring social stability continued in the case Muller v. Oregon, which took place in 1908. In this case, the Supreme Court upheld a law that limited female workers to working 10 hours per day, which may have been a rare win for progressive economic policies. It was a complete loss for progressive social movements, specifically the women's suffrage movement. Since the Supreme Court voted down a law to limit the working hours of men in Launcher v. New York in 1905, by the court agreeing to uphold this law, women were then not able to work the same amount of time as men, which created an unequal playing field. The cartoon Shall Women Vote, which was drawn in 1909, shows several men in line at a polling place, with one man sticking out his hand at an illustration of a woman taking care of children, with change surrounding this image. This image illustrates how women struggled for the right to vote, which is just one example of the many inequalities for women which plague society during this time. This relates to the case since the ruling in Muller v. Oregon essentially stated that women do not have equal rights to men regarding women's right to negotiate a contract. The majority of the justices continue to keep the social structure of inequalities in place by upholding this law, which followed the conservative ideology. The Supreme Court during the Progressive era had a conservative ideology during a time of social and economic transformation. Therefore, the court frequently used judicial activism to check and strike down the progressive laws which were being passed by Congress and even state legislators. The use of textualism, judicial review, and applying the practice of ensuring social order were all used by the court to not uphold progressive legislation. The Supreme Court was able to use their power to influence the direction of the country and slow down the inevitable change which was occurring. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you, Austin. There will also be no live Q&A for this presentation. So we are going to go ahead and go on to our last presentation for this session by Parisa Gopet. Her title is Avant-Garde Art Movements Among Late 19th Century France, Realism, Impressionism, and Post-Impressionism. It's an investigation of socio-economic events which shape realism and caused Impressionism and Post-Impressionism to rise to prominence as avant-garde art movements among the late 19th century France, and her mentor was Leah Clough. So I will go ahead and get started with that, and then there will be a live Q&A after this presentation.
Realism, Impressionism, and Post-Impressionism are some of the most famous French art movements in history. Now, the basis of my project was to research what specific historical events caused these art movements to come about in France during the late 19th century. Throughout this presentation, I will explain these historical events in greater detail, but to give you an overview, I found that realism was heavily shaped by the increasing embrace of empiricist beliefs, which stemmed from the Enlightenment. And I also found that Impressionism was heavily influenced by the Second Industrial Revolution, the immense urbanization of France, and also an increasingly popular ideal of modernist life among the French people at the time. Lastly, I found that Post-Impressionism heavily expanded on this last event of modernist ideals gaining popularity in France. Before moving forward, it's important to note that these art movements were considered avant-garde, and this means that They idealized radical social progress and challenged mainstream expectations of traditional art by trying out new and experimental forms. What mainly shaped the avant-garde movement of realism in the 1840s was this social event of the French people increasingly embracing empiricism, which stems from the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment took place throughout the 18th century and focused on celebrating reason and science over religion and superstition, which was so commonly praised before. And empiricist thinkers of the Enlightenment believed that direct experience and time in the present was the key to progress in life and gaining knowledge. And advances in industrial technology during the 19th century really reinforced the faith in the Enlightenment, and the French public increasingly began to embrace empiricist ideas. Some artists especially began embracing empiricism, and they started incorporating that idea into their artworks. So they believed that only what people could see and experience was considered real, and therefore that was the only worthy subject matter for art. And these artists really focused on illustrating the relevant people and events of their own time, and really detested traditional subject matter, which often included imagery of fictional, mythological, and historical figures. And so these artists who only focused on what was real, they formed the realism art movement. Realism as a style typically followed the traditional form with painting, so very well blended brushstrokes, but it was the subject matter which was so drastically different from classical French art. And this subject matter, it usually portrayed figures which were often unidealized, mundane looking, and often included a lot of imagery of working class laborers and peasants who traditionally were viewed as too unworthy and low class to be showcased in art. And with such a drastic difference, this is what earned realism the title of really being the first avant-garde art movement in France. An excellent example of a realism oil painting would be The Stonebreakers, which was painted by Gustave Courbet in 1849, and this painting shows two working-class men, which is one old and one young, and they're slaving away at the task of stone breaking, which is essentially breaking rocks by hand in order to pave roads with. And the painting has a lot of dry and warm colors used to really emphasize the hardship and uncomfortableness of this task which the men are doing. By choosing to only showcase subject matter that was based on real people and the hardships of everyday life for the working class, Courbet and similar artists really showed how empiricism heavily influenced their work, and how realism as a whole was largely shaped by empiricist ideals because of the way it always reflected the present time in an honest manner. Moving forward, the event which really shaped Impressionism as an art movement in 1870s France was the Second Industrial Revolution and all of the many advancements which it brought. The Second Industrial Revolution officially took place from 1870 to 1914, but much of its development can be traced back to the 1850s. And during the Second Industrial Revolution, there were many new discoveries about resources like oil, chemicals, and steel, and this brought about advancements to technology, engineering, and transportation, just to name a few. For example, the Second Industrial Revolution led to great improvements among railroads based on the new power sources being used, such as the new diesel engine and electrical locomotives. This Industrial Revolution also led to advancements in art supplies, such as new synthetic pigments, paint tubes, and portable easels, which were all new at the time. And this led to a new way of painting called en plein air, which means it's the act of creating art out in the open air, outdoors, in the moment. And this would really become a defining feature among Impressionist paintings moving forward. So due to the newly industrialized France becoming a very popular subject matter for artists
to paint, as well as the advancements in art supplies, the art movement of Impressionism really began to form. Impressionism form really consisted of unblended brushstrokes on canvas, somewhat resembling sketches, because they were painted very spontaneously outdoors in the open, just capturing in-the-moment scenes. And this was very different from traditional painting, which was usually very nicely blended and smooth. And so that's what really made Impressionism an avant-garde movement, because the form was so radically different from traditional styles of painting. An excellent example of an Impressionist painting is the Saint-Lazare train station, painted in 1877 by Claude Monet. And this painting shows a modernized train station in Paris at the time, which is bustling with people and steamy trains. And we see the effects of the Second Industrial Revolution here. And it also accurately presents Impressionist form because of the unblended application of brushstrokes, which Monet used. And he did this because he painted this painting en plein air. With Impressionist paintings often exhibiting scenes of the industrial advancements, such as the train station shown here, and also utilizing the advanced painting supplies to create works in action, we see how the Second Industrial Revolution played a big role in shaping Impressionism as an art style. Another event which significantly shaped Impressionism as an art style was the rapid urbanization of France, which occurred at the time. Due to the great advancements in construction and engineering brought about by the Second Industrial Revolution, France then underwent a period of great urbanization. A notable example of this is how in the late 1860s, the Parisian emperor at the time of Paris, his name was Georges Eugène Haussmann, he oversaw a giant project to redesign all of Paris and completely urbanize it. And so they completely removed all of the medieval Parisian buildings and alleyways and replaced them with new boulevards, paved plazas, new water and sewer systems, new parks and street lighting, and residential and commercial buildings, just to name a few. My example here is a painting called The Boulevard Montmartre on a Winter Morning, which is painted in 1898 by Camille Pissarro. This painting is of a very famous boulevard in Paris, and it shows the newly urbanized Paris under Haussmann's redesigning plans. So it shows the newly paved streets and buildings, and also the busy Parisian people roaming about. It portrays Impressionist form perfectly because, like I mentioned earlier, it has this messy application of paint, since Pissarro did paint this en plein air in the moment. There are many other Impressionist paintings like this one, illustrating France's urbanized settings. And so with this being such a popular subject matter among Impressionist art, it just shows how this event had a great impact on shaping this art movement style. One last event which I want to talk about that played a key role in shaping Impressionism as an art style was how back then there was this increasingly popular ideal for modernism of the self among French society back then. And part of this was how people's social and work lives were changing drastically due to the effects of industrialization and urbanization. Industrialization and the jobs which came with it led to the arrangement of fixed working hours for French people, and also certain times allowed for leisure. Also, the Second Industrial Revolution had brought a greater range of products and activities available to the French people, and the purchasing power of money was also rapidly increasing, so life was becoming more and more modernized. There were many new spaces for leisure and entertainment created for the French people, such as new opera houses, theaters, music halls, circuses, and restaurants, and there were new pastimes becoming popular as well, such as shopping, boating, riverside dining, and dancing, just to name a few. One Impressionist oil painting which perfectly exemplifies this modern new lifestyle among French society is called Luncheon of the Boating Party, created in 1881 by Pierre-Auguste Renoir. And this painting displays French citizens relaxing and dining happily on the balcony of a popular restaurant after coming back from boating. Like the previous paintings discussed, this one exhibits Impressionist style perfectly because Renoir did paint it en plein air, and he really conveys this sense of constant motion and change in the picture by the way he paints the figures' facial expressions, their postures, and the moving activities which they're doing. Some of them are flirting or eating or smoking a pipe, just to name a few. With Renoir's painting here, he shows how being modernized, sociable citizens who engage in fun leisure activities became a very popular ideal within French society during the 1880s. And with this becoming a very common subject matter among Impressionist paintings, it becomes clear how this social historical event really shaped Impressionism as well. Moving forward, the last French avant-garde art movement which I would like to discuss is that of Post-Impressionism, which in the late 1880s was largely a result of the previous societal event which I had talked about. Post-Impressionism was also very shaped by those new ideals of self-modernization among the French people at the time. However, it did begin to expand on this self-modernization on a much deeper level. Continuing to embrace this idea of self-modernization, some artists began to explore this idea of what art could do differently than it had already done so before, and what new styles and ways they could portray art. These kinds of artists began the Post-Impressionism art movement. Post-Impressionism depicted similar subject matter to that of Impressionism, such as showing urban settings and pictures of modern leisure time, often painted en plein air, but unlike Impressionism, Post-Impressionism did not possess any specific form that the artist had to adhere to. Form was open to being uniquely developed by the artist themselves. A perfect example of a post-impressionist oil painting is Café Terrace at Night, painted by Vincent van Gogh in 1888. And this painting illustrates a scene of a coffee house at night in Arles, France, which Van Gogh painted on the spot. While Van Gogh's painting exhibits some signs of Impressionism, such as choosing a subject matter which is of a leisurely site and also painting this en plein air, what makes this painting especially post-impressionist is how he developed his own painting style called impasto. Impasto painting is defined as applying a great amount of paint to the surface of a canvas in order to give it three-dimensional texture, and this was a form of painting which was precisely unique to Van Gogh as an artist. There were also many other post-impressionist artists who experimented with new ways of painting like Van Gogh, with the goals of celebrating the avant-garde. So their boldness and exploration of new techniques really portrayed how the ideal of self-modernism was still greatly expanding in France at the time, and really shaped the post-impressionism art movement. Well, that concludes my findings on what events caused realism, impressionism, and post-impressionism to develop as art movements in France. I hope that next time you view these types of art in a gallery or museum, that you'll feel more knowledgeable about their historical backgrounds. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Parisa. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you for showing it.
Yeah, of course. I loved all the examples you were using. Okay, let me get out of here. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and make this on display. Stop sharing so we can kind of go into our Q&A session. If anyone has any questions for Parisa, this is the time. And Parisa, I'll let you go ahead and pick whoever has a question.
Oh, okay. Yes, Professor Sleeper.
Great job, Parisa. Really enjoyed it. Of course, one of the things I loved was the way that you were able to bring in history, obviously, which of course influences art in many ways. I have to ask, I saw a lot of beautiful art there that you picked out and described. Do you have a favorite piece and why?
Out of the ones that I showed?
Or just generally about Impressionism or Post-Impressionism period? Do you have a favorite one?
I do, that I saw in my textbook, because I did do this this research project as part of my art history honors class. I don't remember the exact name of it, but it's a post-impressionist painting, and post-impressionism was my favorite art movement that we learned about. And what I liked so much about that painting is it looks very so post-impressionism was very different because they started exploring painting strange things and kind of just like I said, being new and different. And there's one painting where the people actually have green skin color, painted in green, and they're at a bar at night, and they're just having fun, but it just looks very strange, and it was a new concept, you know? So that was my favorite because it was very interesting.
Perhaps too much absinthe.
That's
So
exactly what actually, I didn't know you would all be familiar with that.
well done. Thank you so much, Parisa.
Oh, Askar said, nice presentation. Thank you, Askar. Melina?
Yes, I kind of have two. One of them is what inspired you to, go into this topic. I know you love art, but just including impressionism and everything. And then also, have you ever practiced en plein air? I hope I said that right. That style of painting.
Oh, those are such nice questions. I chose these three art movements in the 19th century to focus on because I thought the 19th century history was very interesting when we were learning about that period, and also because these three, especially realism, were the first avant-garde art movements. So they were radically different from the classical French painting that was shown before of like mythological people and just painted really nicely and smoothly. These were the first to be painted in a very different way, more modernized. And I have not painted en plein air outside, but my sister has. Sometimes I've been with her at the beach or something and she'll be painting.
Yeah, that's very cool. I like that style. That was very interesting.
I did want to say before we go to other questions that just seeing all those wonderful pictures of life and activity and fun did get me thinking. I was like, boy, I can't wait till the post-COVID period because of just that picture of being at a luncheon with friends and having food all together. Just I was like, I got sad. I had to turn off my video camera just because it was like, oh no, it just says something that we're missing, isn't it? So
it will come back in time.
Yeah.
Also, I know my presentation wasn't perfect, and I did notice something which I just want to clarify. These pastimes of, like shopping and dancing and all that, obviously they were, I failed to say it properly, where they were occurring before, this time period, but I was basically trying to say that they became much more popular and everybody started doing it, where before it was more, perhaps few people and whatnot, if that makes sense.
Were there any more questions for Parisa?
Thank you, everyone in the honors program for allowing me to do this opportunity. This was my first research conference, and I'm so glad I got to just try it out and maybe improve this and do more research and possibly present it better in the next time.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you, Parisa. I'd also like to add the background music was a great touch. Definitely something to consider for anyone else trying to do OMNI next semester. That was a really good touch. All right, well, yes, thank you for everyone that was here today and all the presenters. Just to let you guys know, we do have a second session of OMNI today starting at 1:30, and then the third session starts at 2:30. So if you do have the time, we'd love to see you there. Again, thank you for all your time. Professor Sleeper, if there's anything you want to add, please go ahead.
No, we have a lot of history. Today has a lot of great history, art history as well, thanks to Parisa. So I hope you come back.
Okay, well, great. Sure.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Awesome. So it's 1:30, so we're going to begin. And we have two presentations in this hour. My name is Christopher Sleeper. I'm the coordinator of the honors program, and I'm just grateful to, again, have a great day of learning. We had a great day yesterday. We had an earlier session with Parisa that went wonderfully. We'll be also having another session after this one and 2 more days in the OMNI on Wednesday and Thursday. We will also be having these presentations posted afterwards. So next week, they'll be live on our YouTube channel, so you can see all of them, and that would be great. So there are a couple things. We were just talking about the conference opportunities. So if you're having a great experience and you want to pursue more conference opportunities, we are going to have a conference in the spring. It's always at the end of the semester, and the deadline is going to be in mid-March. And then also, if you're interested in presenting at the HTCC UC Irvine Research Conference, it's made for 2-year students, and the deadline's coming up on December 18th. And so you can ask questions at honors@miracosta.edu. We'll make sure that that we get them answered quickly, but it's a great opportunity. And I always say that, and Parisa knows this, and Christine as well, that hundreds of thousands of students do research, honors courses, but very few, actually, I would say under 1,000 students do any sort of research. And the reality is maybe about 400 or 500 students actually do some sort of research conference experience. In fact, actually, I know that number is lower because most of the community colleges have actually canceled their research conferences for this year. So it's a great way to add some real weight to your transcript. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us at honors@miracosta.edu. This is a student-run program. I have 2 navigators here today, Parisa and Christine's going to be the moderator for this section. So Christine, take it away.
Hi everyone, I'm Christine, and I think I'm just gonna start off this meeting with showing our community guidelines. Just kind of expectations we have because we do have some live Q&As today. So the first one is know that this is a safe space meant for learning. Practice patience with yourself and others. Speak from personal experience and avoid speaking for others. Give everyone a chance to speak and never interrupt anyone. I know that one can be a little difficult over Zoom with the lag and all. So again, just be a little patient. If you disagree with someone else, ask questions to understand their intent or offer alternative interpretations. Do not repress another person's perspective, and treat everyone with respect, dignity, and kindness, just kind of as you want to be treated. And then, if I can share my screen to a different screen. We will be looking at our first OMNI presenter, who is Ariana Pratzen, and with Professor Sleeper, they're both here today, and she will be presenting on the union of privilege. So let's just start that video.
Hello, my name is Ariana Pratzen, and today I'm going to be presenting the research that I have conducted in my honors history class with Professor Christopher Sleeper. My presentation is called The Union of Privilege, Examples of Inequality in the Civil War. Okay, so some background on the Civil War. This war was huge, and to this day it's one of the biggest, most bloody wars on American soil. To put in perspective just how big this war truly was, I provided some key facts. The Civil War had more American deaths than the American Revolution, World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War combined. About 625,000 men died in the Civil War, and this was about 2% of their population at that time. And in today's percentage, it would be about 6 million Americans dying. This estimated cost of the war is about $6.19 billion, and in today's dollars, it'd be $146 billion. By the end of the war, the federal government was spending about $3.5 million a day. The graph at the bottom demonstrates the amount of casualties in the Civil War compared to the many other wars that the United States had fought in. And in this next slide, I have some pictures to demonstrate how massive this war was. The first picture on the right is showing the casualties based on location, and the graph on the right is showing the casualties based on the major battles of the Civil War. Both of these photos demonstrate the massive amount of death that this war has caused. It also demonstrates how many men's lives were affected. A common theme of the Civil War was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. While the Civil War was a horrible, destructive experience for many, there is clear evidence that wealthier male and female Unionists and Confederates did not have the same experience overall as other social and economic groups. Studying the drafts implemented by the Union and the Confederacy, as well as the social and economic realities of the war's home front, it illustrates the deep divide of this experience. Based on the amount of casualties represented in the previous slides, it is easy to conclude that this war required a lot of manpower. At the beginning of the war, people enlisted in the military voluntarily, and while the war grew longer and more destructive and less people were volunteering, both the Union and the Confederacy were forced to enact a draft. The North enacted the Civil War Draft of 1863, also known as the Enrollment Act. This was passed by Congress to provide the Union with fresh men to support the war. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation, which allowed for African Americans to enlist in the Army. This proclamation declared that as of January 1st, 1863, all enslaved people in the states currently engaged in the rebellion against the Union shall be thenceforth and forever free. After the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, African Americans made up less than 1% of the North's population, but were 10% of the Union's army. There were many ways for people to avoid the draft, but it came at a price at which not all men at this time were able to pay. This added to the theme of a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. The first way to avoid the draft was substitutes. Someone who was drafted could pay a substitute to enlist in his place, and this would cost about $300, and in today's dollars it would be about $5,000. There was also a commutation fee of $300, and this fee allowed anyone could pay the Union $300 and they would be avoided to be drafted. There was also medical exemptions, which would include poor vision, hearing, loss of limbs, fingers or toes, and also bunions could all lead to the disqualification of being drafted. As opposed to the Enrollment Act, the Confederacy enacted the Conscription Act, and this forced all men between the ages of 18 and 45 to be deemed eligible to be drafted into the Civil War. While there was ways to avoid the draft in the North, there was also ways to avoid the draft in the South. The South had passed the 20 Slave Act in October of 1862, which was the beginning of African Americans serving in the war. It was voluntarily, but it was still the beginning of African American lives being integrated into the war. This was where a man who was drafted into the war could send 20 slaves in place of him in order to avoid being the one who was actually fighting in the war. In December of 1863, a rich drafted man could hire a substitute to take his place in the ranks. This was the same as the Union substitute exemption, except that the price ranged as high as $3,000 at the time, and that was even higher in Confederate currency. The picture on the left is a poster about being against the Conscription Act, and the picture on the right is a paper signed by the Confederate of the United States passing the 20 Slave Act. Wealthy people of this time were getting wealthier while the poor were getting poorer and dying on the battlefield. In 1843, there were only 20 millionaires in the entire United States, but by 1863, New York City alone had more than 100. Smart, wealthy people were able to capitalize on the goods that the government needed in order to support the entirety of the Civil War. People of wealth were able to not worry about supporting their families or being drafted, and instead were able to take a step back and look at how they could profit off the war. Two examples of who was able to profit off of the war was J.P. Morgan and Samuel Francis DuPont. Morgan, who is the picture on the right side of the screen, he bought old weapons from the Mexican-American War at a very low price, reassembled them, and then when the government needed more artillery to support the Civil War, Morgan resold these weapons back to them at a much higher price. Samuel Francis DuPont is the photo of the man on the left side of the screen, and the gunpowder is the keg, that picture. And DuPont provided over half of the Union's gunpowder, and he did so by selling the government gunpowder at a much higher price. This allowed him to make much more money than he was spending. The New York draft riots were in response to the draft laws passed by Congress, resulting in the drafting of most of the working class. After the draft had been enacted, the working class of New York became very frustrated with the disproportionate amount of poor men fighting in the war. Many white working class, a lot of Irish immigrants, started by protesting, and it led to violent riots. Many of the Irish immigrants were also frustrated with the lack of job opportunities in the city with the growing amount of free working African American population. Lasting about 5 days, finally the military troops were able to put a stop to the riots. The illustrated pictures give insight to what the riots looked like in the city. Men that were unable to pay the expensive fees to avoid being drafted into the war had to leave their wives, homes, and families behind to serve. This left the home front to become an area that was predominantly controlled by women. While this was a great way for women to start integrating themselves into the workforce and to be seen as equal, there were societal norms that prevented from an easy advancement. Women who were stepping up and taking jobs in the workforce to support themselves and their families were seen as promiscuous because they were entering a field with lots of men while their husbands were away. Instead of being praised by their efforts, some were torn down. Women also found ways to aid the war with becoming either nurses or spies. For example, Rebecca Usher became a nurse, and she traveled from Portland to Philadelphia to help wounded soldiers in a hospital, and she wrote in a letter to her sister that she had found her native element. This is demonstrated by the letter on the right side of the screen. Wealthy women of the war aided in the war in ways that they knew how. It wasn't physical, but it was still helpful. The wealthy women of the Confederacy were called the Ladies' Aiken Relief Association, and the wealthy women of the Union were called the Women's Central Relief Association. These associations staged benefits to raise money for troops. They made aid societies to help send food and clothing. They set up rest stops for those men in transit. They sent medicine, and they also established hospital associations to help the wounded soldiers. Finally, we're going to take a look at how the military gains most of their manpower today. And today, many military enlistees are known to join based on incentives. Incentives such as employment or to further their education. The military disproportionately recruits students from lower income school areas, knowing that the higher income school areas have less worries about their finances for schooling after high school. While the service of the military is open for all, it is still a rich man's luxury and a poor man's fight. Thank you so much for taking the time today to listen to my presentation on a Union of Privilege, Examples of Inequality in the Civil War. I am very grateful for this opportunity, and I also want to thank Professor Sleeper for all the help and support he has given me throughout this semester and project. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Ariana, for that awesome presentation. I don't believe there is a live Q&A.
I think Professor Sleeper wanted me to, so I can do that.
All right. If you are willing to answer some questions, then if anyone from the audience has any questions, you can type it in the chat or raise your hand, just unmute yourself.
So, Ariana, I'll start. In terms of this project, obviously it's a research project. What do you think was the most difficult source you had to work with, or what was the hardest piece of historical evidence that you had to work with?
I think that the primary sources were kind of hard to understand just because some of their language is a little bit different, and depending on their education level, it was a little bit more difficult to understand what they're saying. But it was all pretty interesting, and I like the primary sources to give perspective from people during that time.
Great. And what do you think is the biggest kind of resource or tool that you've been working on in this course in terms of like the different things that we worked on in our course? What do you think is the kind of the most useful tool? Because you're not a historian. What do you think is going to be the kind of skill that you're going to take away from our class?
Well, I feel like just the layout of our class really just makes it all tie together. You provide primary sources, videos, and reading. Because I feel like when I read, I get it, but it's not so much like, I like auditory as well. So I just feel like everything combined makes it easier because history is not my strongest subject, but I actually enjoyed it very much this semester.
It looks like we have a question from the chat. So Denise is wondering, what drew you to research more about this war and not any other war?
Well, so I wanted from this year, I feel like I was looking more at my own personal privilege and just kind of where it all stems from. And I feel like this is kind of where it starts to break through slightly for equality. So I was interested just kind of getting more insight on that. But thank you for your question and your comment.
I have one question kind of along with that.
Mhm.
Do you think, if you could choose one thing, what do you think is like the biggest takeaway from this research topic?
One of the biggest takeaways I would think is kind of seeing how much the women were involved in the war, because I just didn't know any about that. And one of the sources was this book, but they kind of went more into detail about like there was actually women that fought in the war, but secretly, and just I really liked seeing how they were involved in it.
Awesome. I have another question in the chat. Did anything stand out in connecting with the people who wrote your primary sources?
Especially with Rebecca Usher, she kind of, one of her quotes was that she found her native element in working in the hospital life, which I found was super interesting. And like in the book, it says how women at that time kind of were feeling like they couldn't do much to help. So when they did, it was like kind of like exciting for them, as much as it was not the best time, but yeah.
All right, thank you. Is there any more questions?
Thank you.
All right, awesome job. It was a great presentation.
Thank you so much, Christine.
I think we're just going to continue on with our next. Share screen. Our next presenter is Audrey Jung with Professor Sleeper on the Cherokee Nation in the Civil War.
Hi, my name is Audrey Jung, and I chose to do my presentation on the Cherokee Nation and their role in the Civil War. So as we know, the Civil War began in April of 1861, and despite the fact that it was probably the bloodiest conflict in the United States, the role of Native Americans are greatly underrepresented. So this is just kind of what brought me to this topic and what brought my interest to this topic. So before I get started, I wanted to give a little bit of context on the Cherokee Nation. So the Cherokee Nation was already quite divided because of pre-existing feuds between two leaders, which were Stan Wadey on the left and Chief John Ross on the right. So this feud goes back to a couple decades in the 1830s when the tribe was moved to a reservation in Oklahoma. And so once they arrived and settled in, this feud increased because this political leadership was just starting to get sorted out. So there's always this kind of power struggle between them. And so it was just very unstable. But eventually Ross and Wadey shook hands to establish unity in the government that was really needed. But interestingly, with the outbreak of the Civil War, this kind of reinstilled divisiveness as different interests would begin to clash. And so you can see this one tribe, two different stances. And so these two leaders in the tribe had very different stances. So the first stance was by Stan Wadey and his followers, which were called the Knights of the Golden Circle. And essentially, this was a small faction of the tribe that was pro-slavery and stood for the expansion of slave states. Chief John Ross actually states that the secret group led by Wadey had or wanted to advance separate political goals, very similar to the Confederacy. So as a result, Stan Wadey and his followers were really quick to ally with the Confederacy. But on the other hand, John Ross and the majority of the tribe that followed him were pretty much very hesitant because they didn't forget that the Confederacy was still part of the same government that drove them out of their lands 30 years ago. So essentially, they had no reason to trust the Confederacy. And Ross even states that there was no reason to join if there wasn't even a reason for involvement. So they just thought that it was pointless for the tribe to get involved and suffer countless casualties for no substantial reason. Ross initially declared neutrality, thinking of the tribe's best interests. So it's really important to mention that the majority of the tribe actually didn't want to even be involved in this war. But eventually, Ross and the rest of the Cherokee Nation joined hands with the Confederacy despite their initial stance of neutrality. And there were actually 4 reasons for this, and the reasons are directly pulled from a document called the Declaration of Causes that basically established Cherokee alliance with the Confederacy. So the first reason was the lack of defense, and this was because the Union troops essentially abandoned the Native American territories because of the upcoming war, and that left the Cherokee and other tribes defenseless if anything were to happen to them. And additionally, because Stan Wadey and his forces already joined the Confederacy, there was this additional lack of protection because Stan Wadey was actually a very tactical and tough military leader in the tribe. And the second reason was that the Cherokee Nation couldn't turn a blind eye to increasing northern aggression and oppressive conduct. And they specifically stated their disappointment that the leaders of the Northern Union would let inmates and foreign mercenaries to be enlisted in the Union to help burn and destroy these southern states. And they saw the treatment of innocent citizens that weren't even involved in this war, and so it just caused a lot of uneasiness within the tribe. So this was just one reason that the Cherokee Nation thought was very against the rules of typical war. The third reason was the fear of invasion. So while they saw all this destruction and chaos happening, they still had a lack of defense, and they were increasingly afraid that it wasn't a matter of time before the Union would invade their tribe too. So at this point, Ross and the Cherokee government really had to reconsider what would be of their best interest. And then the last reason, the last pushing factor, was the observation that the Confederate armies were slowly attaining victories. So victories at Bull Run and Wilson's Creek gave the Confederacy credibility that perhaps this side could protect them and even win this war. And if the Confederacy did win this war, the Cherokee Nation thought that they could negotiate far better terms of sovereignty and rights of the tribe. So this Cherokee Nation reconsidered their neutrality, and officially, both sides, Stan Wadey and Ross, joined the Confederate cause in October of 1861. And when they joined the Confederacy, they were involved in more than 15 to 20 skirmishes, but for the sake of time, 2 of the most significant battles were the battles of Chistanaw and Pea Ridge. So the Battle of Chistanaw happened in Oklahoma in December 26 of 1861, and this was essentially fought by the Confederate Cherokee and Choctaw tribe against the Union Creek and Seminole forces. And their goal was basically to subdue these Union forces in Native American territories. So on the right here, I included a map of the Chistanaw battlefield of the time. And right here, within the red lines, 1,700 Union soldiers were secluded near this hill. So the Confederacy devised a plan where they would attack from multiple directions. And eventually they were able to intercept and surprise the Union forces, which is why this led to the Confederacy attaining this victory. And the Cherokee played a very crucial role in having these forces retreat. And eventually the result was that Union forces were completely eliminated. And the second most significant battle was the Battle of Pea Ridge. And this battle had perhaps the most involvement of Native Americans. Pea Ridge was practically part of a larger campaign for the control of Missouri. And though the Confederacy lost, the Cherokee played a very important role. And this was on March 5th the 1st and 2nd Cherokee Mounted Rifles were sent to Arkansas to attack Union forces. And Wade and his forces were able to take a lot of supplies, including cannons and guns, but most importantly, they were able to disperse the Union position on Foster's Farm. And it was a very minor role in this battle in particular, but in a microscopic view, that small victory was very important for the early Confederate success in that battle. So the Cherokee were very involved in pretty much small-scale battles and skirmishes most often. And although they did not look as grand and big, they were very crucial steps towards how the outcomes of these Confederate battles would go. So the Cherokee did play a very influential role. But eventually, a lot of the Cherokee soldiers would end up abandoning the Confederacy to switch to the Union side for a variety of reasons. So, in the perspective of the Cherokee, they saw that the Union was coming closer and closer to native lands, and in this process, the Confederate Army actually withdrew their protection because they needed to use those forces to fight the Union that was drawing closer. So eventually, the Union would succeed, and their forces entered Cherokee lands in the summer of 1862, practically after the Battle of Pea Ridge. And it was at this moment that a lot of people began to abandon the Confederate side. Eventually, Colonel Weirs actually offers a chance for Ross to join the Union side, and Ross does, and he does take this chance. And in return, Ross revealed Confederate supply posts near them. So, in the Cherokee perspective, the Union was becoming more and more successful in this war, and considering that the Confederates withdrew their protection, they were kind of forced to reconsider joining the Union side, which was practically, I would say, their only choice if they wanted to have another chance to negotiate terms for perhaps sovereignty or rights. And so this was the Cherokee perspective, and the Union Cherokee recruits would be called the 3rd Indian Home Guard. And basically at this point, the Union definitely had an upper hand in the Civil War. And strategically, in the Union perspective, they needed to take these lands from the Confederates and retake Kansas and Missouri to prepare for the 7 Days battles. And I included a map of what exactly that was. And so this was very crucial. And they also wanted to return these Cherokee refugees that abandoned the Confederate side to their homes and perhaps persuade them, and they did persuade them, to ally with the Union. So, in the perspective of the Union, it was very beneficial that these tribes chose to ally with them because they wouldn't need to spend that extra time fighting these forces. So, eventually, these Cherokee armies would make contributions on the Union side as well. So, in the Second Battle of Newtonia, which took place in October 28, General Solomon ordered the 3rd Indian Home Guard, which was the Cherokees, and the Kansas Cavalry to head to Missouri. And upon arrival, this situation was pretty grim. And this was because the Confederates already had a very strong position behind buildings and walls, and they were holding out. But again, the Union forces, their side was very grim. So the 3rd Indian Home Guard and the Kansas Cavalry essentially needed to hold out until reinforcements came. And the Cherokee was able to greatly contribute to this battle because they were under attack for, I would say, about 3 hours, but they were able to hold their position even to the point where they ran out of ammunition. And they were able to prevent the Confederates from quickly marching onwards to a victory. So, in the aftermath of the Civil War, the Cherokees as a whole, including the Cherokees that served for the Union, were labeled as traitors. And this was very surprising and unfair because the government had promised the Cherokees that had sided with the Union that they would pardon the fact that they did side with the Confederacy before, but this clearly just didn't happen. And basically, the government treated the tribes as ones who had lost the war, and they did this to dictate power of new treaties, and this eventually practically threatened the sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation. This was obviously very shocking and appalling to the Cherokee Nation, so they did appeal, and a new treaty was created, which pardoned the Cherokee that served in the Confederacy, but the Cherokee were still forced to concede a very large portion of their lands, which also affected their crops. And eventually there was also a famine as well. So, in conclusion, the Cherokee Nation didn't really attain any sort of advancements in sovereignty from either side of the Civil War. And I included some statistics. 22% of the nation were killed after the war ended, and 35% of adult females were left as widows, and many children were left orphaned. So, in this larger perspective, the Cherokee Nation practically took their stances in the Civil War because they felt that they really had no other choice but to protect their rights and people in that way. And they did make very important contributions, but later on you see that they're back to square one. with very devastating blows to their population and property as well. So this just kind of highlights the reoccurring pattern of Native American treatment in the United States. So this is just very, very important, these consequences, despite how involved they were in both the Confederate and Union side. Thank you. That is the end of my presentation.
All right, that was awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much to Audrey for that awesome presentation. We do not have a live Q&A for this one, and we do, I believe, have a break right now before we continue on with the rest of the presentations this afternoon. So we will be back. There's about a half an hour break, so we can be back at about 2:30. You're welcome to turn off your camera or just rejoin the Zoom meeting, whatever makes you most comfortable. Hi everyone, my name is Christine, and I just wanted to start off this session with our community expectations because we do have a few live Q&As. So our first one is, know that this is a safe space meant for learning. Practice patience with yourself and others. 2, speak from personal experience and avoid speaking for others. Give everyone a chance to speak and never interrupt others, which I know can be difficult with especially over Zoom with lag and all, but we just need to be patient with that. 4, if you disagree with someone, ask questions to understand their intent or offer alternative interpretations. Do not repress others' perspectives. And lastly, treat everyone with respect, dignity, and kindness, just how you want to be treated. And we're going to start off our first one with Dan Maroney, who is here and will be doing a live Q&A. His mentor is Professor Sleeper, who we just heard from, and he is presenting on women in naval aviation.
Although women had been working as Navy nurses as far back as the Civil War, it wasn't until the United States entered World War I in 1917 that it allowed women to officially serve in the Naval Reserve. At 20 years old, Loretta Walsh of Pennsylvania became the first woman to enlist in the U.S. Navy, and subsequently became the first female petty officer. Women who enlisted at this time served as yeomen, radio operators, and in other support roles. With the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the Navy suddenly found itself in need of personnel. As a result, the WAVES program was established, allowing thousands of women to directly support the war effort. Like their male counterparts, WAVES also had to maintain naval regulations and discipline. At naval air stations around the country, it was common to see WAVES as aviation machinist mates, parachute riggers, and control tower crew. In February of 1973, 8 women were chosen to attend naval flight training in Pensacola, Florida. By 1974, 6 of them had earned their famed Wings of Gold. It was a milestone for the Navy, the military, and aviation itself. Since then, thousands of women have become aviators, naval flight officers, and naval air crewmen. Pictured are Lieutenant Junior Grade Barbara Ann Allen, Ensign Jane M. Skiles, Lieutenant Junior Grade Judith Neufer, and Ensign Kathleen L. McNary at the Naval Aerospace Medical Institute aboard NAS Pensacola. After receiving her wings, Judith Neufer became the first woman to pilot the P-3 Orion. Assigned to VW-4 out of NAS Jacksonville, she also became the first woman to fly through a hurricane. In more recent history, in January of 2012, Lieutenant Nydia Williams, Lieutenant Ashley Ruick, Lieutenant Ashley Ellison, and Lieutenant Commander Brandy Jackson of VAW-125 were part of the first all-female crew to fly a combat mission over the Arabian Sea. Today, women are an extremely important pillar of naval aviation, and no job is unopen to them. Whether that be as aircraft mechanics, flight deck crew, air crewmen, or naval aviators, women in the Navy are making history in the fleet every single day.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that amazing presentation. It says that you are going to do a live Q&A, so if there's anyone in the audience who has a question, just share it in the chat or raise your hand, unmute yourself, and go ahead and ask.
So Dan, I'll ask the first question. In terms of your interest, do you consider yourself more of a military historian, a naval historian? Where did the interest come from with this project, and where does it kind of stem from?
I would say both. I would say the history came first. I mean, just growing up, I was always interested in history, and a bit of military history, which actually led me to join the Navy in the first place. And then being in the Navy, it kind of just grew upon that. Being in Pensacola, being able to go to the Museum of Naval Aviation, which is an amazing museum. And I've actually volunteered there as well. So just, being able to be around that history in person, it just kind of led in this direction. So I don't know, yeah, I would say it's both really. I mean, I love the maritime aspect, and I love the history of the military history. So it just kind of works out.
So Dan, we're working on a contract right now. What are some of the research, what is the research that you're doing right now? And what do you think is the most fascinating part that you might be presenting at a future OMNI conference with what you're researching?
Right, so right now I'm actually doing the maritime history of San Diego, which, as we all probably know, is pretty connected with the Navy. So just looking into, the Naval History and Heritage Command, which is where I got a lot of the sources for this video as well. It just all ties in with the history of San Diego, and I'm hoping to really bring that story in March at the next conference.
All right, we have a question from the chat, and Keith asks, what's the most surprising thing you learned in your research?
Probably the most surprising thing is just how recent a lot of these milestones are still being made, which I actually experienced in the Navy myself. I mean, we're still going through, integration. I mean, that's what they called it. They called it integration, and so that's why I decided to do this in the first place, just because it was pretty inspirational, especially it's just, it's an ongoing process. And to this day, actually, the aviator who was in the last image of the presentation, she was the first African-American fighter pilot. And this was just, in the past couple of years that this happened. So it's still ongoing. And that's what I think is, pretty surprising. You would think that, this is something that we have figured out, but we don't. It's still a work in process. There's still, hurdles that need to be overcome.
Oh, sorry. Parisa, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I was saying, Dan, your presentation was so interesting and wonderful. And I have two questions. The first one is, what software did you use to put together your video? And also, do you know if there's any discrimination towards women in naval aviation today? Because you did show how wonderful, it is for them, but is there any discrimination at all?
Sure. So to answer your first question, I used Adobe Premiere Pro. I was actually a film major before switching. So I have a little bit of experience with that. So yeah, pretty cool program. I love it for any type of video editing. And then second question, unfortunately, yes. You know, a lot of parts, a lot of groups and communities within the Navy are still a bit of a man's world. I mean, I saw it myself, there's still, sexism and, there's still like this perception that, women can't do the job that men can do. But, as I said earlier, I saw it for myself. And in most cases, women were, more enthusiastic about getting things done than the men were. So, yeah, unfortunately, as I said, there's still hurdles to be overcome. But it goes from the top down, and hopefully, our leadership becomes, more progressive as time passes. And, I hope that, that discrimination disappears.
Yes, hopefully. Thank you. That perfectly answers my question.
We have another question from chat from Robert, and he asks, are there women pilots flying F-35s on carriers today?
No, I actually don't know about that one, but I mean, the women go through the same pipeline as men. So I can at least say that if, men are training to fly F-35s, then women are too.
And another question is, what inspired you to research about women instead of men regarding the military, since it is male dominated?
Yeah, so it was personal experience, basically. Had a lot of colleagues who are women, and as in my previous answers, just having the opportunity to work with them was really inspirational, and that's where I got the idea for this project.
All right, beautiful. Thank you so much for answering all of our questions. It was an amazing presentation, so thank you so much. We will move on to the next one, which is Madeline Jerez with Professor Sleeper. And the theme is, to mean well is not enough, the presidential negligence that did not stop the Civil War.
Hi, my name is Madeline Juarez, and the title of my project is To Mean Well is Not Enough, the Presidential Negligence That Did Not Stop the Civil War. Whatever the result may be, I shall carry to my grave the consciousness that I at least meant well for my country, said James Buchanan when addressing the imminent civil unrest he saw in the country he led. To mean well but to not act on it was the normal in 1850, where the United States federal government saw themselves diffusing a bomb on an increasingly difficult issue to mediate: slavery. With new territories acquired by the United States in the wake of the Mexican-American War, the Compromise of 1850 was passed, which allowed California to be free and Utah and New Mexico to decide for themselves to be slave or free states. And yet what the government saw as the best of both worlds for their divided nation was only a band-aid on the issue of slavery. Over the next 11 years, unrest continued. Fights in Congress became normal, and no president saw his second term. The issue of slavery created such a deep chasm within the government that it could not be fixed by presenting ideals and trying to appease both the North and the South at the same time. This was fully evident by the time James Buchanan became president in 1857. During his presidency, instead of finding practical solutions to his nation's problems, he leaned on constitutional idealism. His tactic to respond to the unrest was avoidance. The issue was, civil rights disagreements were seldom kept at bay by allowing each side of the argument to practice what they desired. When Lincoln gained presidency in 1861, he changed things. While Lincoln remains a martyr for the pursuit of true equality to the American people, what was different about him from any previous president was his active pursuit of the perfect union he so greatly desired. As displayed by Lincoln's active policymaking, his understanding of the inevitability of war, and his unsolicited hatred for slavery, he had the ability to do what Buchanan couldn't: navigate a war with protection of the country in mind. Lincoln's passion to preserve the Union, no matter what happened to him, gave him the ability to abolish slavery and change the trajectory of the United States. James Buchanan seemed like the perfect choice to take on the presidency in 1857. He was a career politician, working in Congress as a senator, as a cabinet officer, as the Democratic Party leader, and a foreign minister to Great Britain. Many in politics saw the presidential office as a downgrade, seeing executive power as static in comparison to a congressional position. Buchanan saw it as an honor, but did not desire to have the same complacency that so many previous presidents had succumbed to. Rather, he wanted to make actual change on things he didn't have the ability to when he was in Congress. What stood in his way was the constitutional blockades Buchanan saw, which limited his power nationally. So he focused his efforts on anything international as a way to exhibit his power. He was not the typical complacent president, as he actually desired to use his presidency to make change in ways he saw as beneficial for his countrymen, or at least the ones he agreed with. And yet still, personal agendas of change were not helpful in such a time of crisis within the country. Buchanan desired to do nothing outside of his belief system, and to elicit no change that did not directly benefit him. He wanted to maintain his perfect country, a slave-holding, undivided nation. His policies towards any civil unrest happening in the nation reflected these views. On the issue of slavery, he publicly favored the ability for people to own slaves when territories had not yet officially become states. Yet in his inaugural address to Congress, he simply said that he encouraged leaving the slave or free issue up to the states. He simultaneously held Southern presenting views and did not want to ruffle any feathers, encouraging those in the South to, quote, stand up for their rights and create even more civil conflict to pursue getting the territories to do the same. His belief that slavery in the United States is beyond the reach of any human power except that of respective states themselves wherein it exists was not as uniting as he thought it was, because he did not fully grasp that most in the North would maintain an anti-slavery stance even if it was deemed constitutional. He underestimated the effect of his words and biased public standpoints, and only worked to solve problems to maintain the status quo. The problem was, half the Union was already ready to start a civil war to change the status quo. In February of 1858, Buchanan officially supported the Lecompton Constitution, which would have allowed for slavery in Kansas. This was one of Buchanan's only public advocacies during his presidency, and he created an environment for it to pass. Besides Buchanan's direct advocacy, there were also subsequent rumors of voter fraud and huge advocacy through the administration's newspaper, the Washington Union. Despite this, the Constitution did not pass. The commonality of empty advocacy by Buchanan was exemplary of his leadership as a whole, which was biased. Though he was called to action more than the complacent presidents who had come before him, he did not see the gravity of the issue of slavery as something he needed to see objectively, though he would have said publicly that he did. He advocated for pro-slavery America, but failed to realize that what he saw as policy, abolitionists, Republicans, and many others saw as a human rights issue. What he saw as a band-aid on the issue of slavery did not even serve as such, but simply delayed action long enough to deflect his personal responsibility. He believed his advocacy was enough to quiet unrest until his time of presidency was over, and he was right. When Lincoln was past the presidency, he also inherited a proverbial dumpster fire of political unrest. While civil war did not break out during the Buchanan administration, his advocacy for the Lecompton Constitution had divided what was left of harmony within the Union. Pro-slavery Americans came from neighboring states to advocate for the new territories to be slave states, and anti-slavery advocates refused to vote in what they saw to be biased elections. Even before his inauguration, Lincoln saw division as the trajectory towards the downfall of the Union. The most notable of his consistent views is the speech he made when he accepted the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate seat from Georgia in 1858. The famous biblical phrase, quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," was used by Lincoln to show his understanding that the state of the Union was changing, whether he desired it to or not. Further, the implication of this statement was nowhere near consent for the Civil War, but provided an understanding that the nation could not be at rest until one group got their way over the other. Immediately, Lincoln saw the impending doom of the Civil War as something that needed to be actively pursued in order to be avoided, rather than waiting for problems to arise and suturing them the way that Buchanan had. By the time of the presidential election in 1860, nearly no one approved of the passive advocacy that Buchanan offered. His Southern supporters had been turned off by his inability to make Kansas a slave state, so much so that he had not been chosen for the Democratic ticket. Additionally, Northern sympathizers saw right through his impartial advocacy. Lincoln won the election. True to his character, he immediately jumped into action. He expanded the National Army and Navy, worked to hold state militias accountable for their unconstitutional actions, blockaded southern ports, and even spent $2 million without congressional approval throughout his 4 years in office. Though these, among many other of his actions, seemed radical, Lincoln saw them as necessary in order to solve the problems of war that rose up around him during his time as president. He even made a public declaration of war before calling Congress to an emergency session, in the process of breaking many laws and constitutional provisions that a president should follow. All of this was not due to disregard or disrespect for the government he represented, but rather he saw it as a necessary evil to keep the beloved Union he loved from dissolving into different nations in both political thought and physical border. Lincoln's main fear was not legalism, but rather the imminent possibility to, quote, "lose the nation and yet preserve the Constitution." This style of leadership was brand new to the position of U.S. presidency. The radical change Buchanan believed he was bringing paled in comparison to the radical activity from Abraham Lincoln. His strategy of unilateral action made him more of a coordinate to the other branches of government rather than a subordinate like all previous presidents had been. The issue of slavery was on the forefront of both presidents' minds during their presidencies. The way their personal views affected their political advocacy was quite obvious, but their contrast is in what they believed slavery meant for the Union as a whole. While Buchanan saw the constitutional excuse to not make true change domestically, his authority on foreign affairs was a place he showed support for the South over the North. He saw expansion of the South as a way to get more slave states, seeing as that he failed to create a slave state out of Kansas. Through his whole presidency, he deeply desired to acquire Cuba as a territory, which from an outward perspective may have resembled a simple expansion of U.S. power, but specifically Cuba was very intriguing for the Southern ideal, with its 400,000 slaves. His South American imperialist agenda is what he pleaded for the whole last year of his presidency, even going so far as to pleading to Congress to allow U.S. troops to frequent Mexico because their presence as neighbors to the U.S. was full of, quote, anarchy and confusion. This focus on foreign relationships was not random. It was a way for Buchanan to support the South with all that he saw in his constitutional power, which was mostly international affairs. Both his ignorance of domestic affairs and focus on foreign affairs spoke to his position on slavery, even if he didn't. Lincoln, on the other hand, understood the North's distaste for slavery. While he cared most about the Union staying whole, he personally detested slavery. This idea was evident in a letter Lincoln wrote to his close friend, Joshua Speed, 6 years before he was elected president. Due to the fact that this letter was to a friend, Lincoln gave his true and honest viewpoints on the institution of slavery. With very little political power at the time, Lincoln outlined his frustrations with the state of the Union in the same way Buchanan had described in this paper. He saw the Union as complacent. He criticized Northern lawmakers for not being in the interest of the American people and criticized U.S. citizens for voting for complacent lawmakers who did not represent their values. He believed Northern people crucify their feelings in order to maintain loyalty to the Constitution and the Union, but saw that would not work forever, citing the territories like Kansas as an example. Lincoln's integrity in thought is evident through his immediate action as president, as he saw the presidency as an opportunity to change the Union from the inside. With increasing presidential responsibility, over the years, Lincoln became increasingly radicalized in his views on slavery. He began to see the freedom of those who were slaves as a constitutional responsibility, pointing out that if slavery was not wrong, nothing was wrong. His growth through his presidency shows his passion for the country over anything personal, as his justification was not for his own benefit the way Buchanan's was. He did what he thought was right for the Union, even if it meant sacrificing his own reputation as a politician, or his own life a year later. Lincoln, like many other great men, only became deeply loved after his death. His radical and unconstitutional activity as president made him hated by many, and yet his actions led to the Emancipation Proclamation, the largest push towards progress America had experienced to that point. Where Buchanan failed to recognize that the North would never see slavery as constitutional, Lincoln saw a way to maintain the Union through the change in government. Where fear of being unconstitutional and radical had held Buchanan back and made him feel helpless and avoidant towards the impending doom of the Civil War, Lincoln saw the necessity to protect the Union, which he valued over everything else. Lincoln's active approach to presidency was overshadowed by active courts and Congress in the presidencies that followed him. But Lincoln was the first to create an obligation for active presidency in the times of national emergency. Whether that means Lyndon B. Johnson pushing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or George Bush asking for congressional approval to invade Iraq directly following 9/11, in times of crisis, presidents respond rather than waiting for the other two branches to step in and offer solutions. The legacy Lincoln left was one easily admirable, as he was killed directly after doing something great. But his legacy lives on, even past being a better president than Buchanan. All right, that's the end. These are my sources. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, awesome presentation. I do believe we're doing a live Q&A for this one. So Madeline, are you here?
Yeah.
Awesome. Does anyone have any questions right now that you could just put in chat or raise your hands about? Go ahead, Professor Sleeper.
Oh, Maddie, I've always wondered, Buchanan is from Pennsylvania, right? But he seems to be almost Southern by disposition. I know that Pennsylvania, depending, where you are in Pennsylvania, can sometimes, oftentimes drift a little bit, more central. And I know he was a moderate Democrat. How can you explain that he seems to be almost Southern by interest in political persuasion than you might say, all of those ideas that were coming out of the North that had to do with abolitionism and many of those kind of ideas?
So I think, sorry, my voice is like really cracky. Obviously, I was sick when I was presenting that, and I'm not totally healthy now. But I think it had a lot to do with his career as a politician. Like he wasn't in Pennsylvania for a lot of it, and because like there was so much polarity within Congress and like within government at the time, I think he found that his views became like very like even though he might have had moderate views like beginning his political career, the fact that he was around many other politicians who had like very, very opposing views might have forced him to pick a side over like staying where he wanted to be originally, I guess.
So a lot of people say that James Buchanan was the country's worst president. Do you agree with that, or do you find that there's someone else that we're overlooking?
So the more that I dive into like learning about specific presidents, the more I realize that usually there will be many bad things and many good things that they've done. And I think the reason that Buchanan is kind of like labeled as America's worst president is because he doesn't have a lot of redeeming qualities. A lot of presidents, like they'll do really terrible things, but then there'll be like something that they did that was great. Like even I did my research paper for like one of my history classes last semester on the Vietnam War, and I learned a lot about LBJ and like his political motivations and involvement in Vietnam specifically. But like in the end of this presentation, I was talking about him signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So it's like there are good things and bad things that like most other presidents did, but because Buchanan didn't do anything except for kind of like fight for what he wanted. I think that's why he'd be labeled as that. So I think I agree. I think.
Great job, Maddie. Thank you.
Maddie, that was a very nice presentation. Thank you for sharing.
I do have a question. Do you have plans for future research in this topic, or are you going to dive deeper into something similar? And if so, what?
I think I'm going to try to go to other conferences with this specific research. Honestly, I've never really been that interested in the Civil War before. I'm more of like a World War I, World War II type of gal, but this is like actually made me super interested in it. So maybe, I don't know.
Awesome. Does anyone have any other questions for Maddie? Looks like we have one in the chat. With all of the election conflict, do you think that the same passive indifference will lead to the same disastrous consequences today?
So I think, I mean, I don't want to like predict the future here. There are like a ton of parallels between this election and the election between Buchanan and Lincoln, especially with issues of like civil unrest. They're very different issues today, but Buchanan, when he like during the election of 1860, he didn't expect himself to get reelected, but he kind of still held the perspective that he was like the quote that I said in the beginning, like he held the perspective that he was a really good president. And I think that that can be kind of like toxic in nature. And I do see a similar thing happening with this exchange of power. So I think there are definitely some parallels, but I don't think it's necessarily going to lead to the same result.
All right, thank you so much. We don't have any more questions. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was awesome, and I wish you luck in the other conferences. All right, so the next presentation is by Christian Moroccan with Professor Sleeper, and his is on the Reconstruction reversal, how failed Reconstruction era policies can keep America great.
Hi, my name is Christian Moroccan, and I'm currently attending Miracosta College. For my history research project, I wanted to take into consideration the calls for political reform and the pandemic currently affecting us in one way or another, and how we should approach the situation and the rise of movements such as Black Lives Matter as we attempt to go back to a state of being normal. Today, I will be presenting Reconstruction Reversal, how Reconstruction era policies can keep America great. The year 2020 has been a turbulent and unexpected year for everyone as the nation battles the coronavirus alongside the rest of the world. As both global and domestic leaders scramble to find an earnest solution to the pandemic while easing the economic havoc that it has caused, the current reforms being discussed for the country and economy have been bombarded by political protesters who have used the spotlight to address institutional racism and police brutality against Black Americans. Although these movements have gained international speculation, they are not recent creations and have been fighting for justice for years, such as when protesters took to the streets in 2014 when Eric Garner was choked to death to avoid similar situations from occurring again, such as in March and May of this year when Breonna Taylor and George Floyd were also killed by police officers. Adjacent to the murders of Black Americans, they face attempts of voter disenfranchisement in southern states as right-wing politicians attempt to re-elect the sitting president, Donald Trump. What issues plague the African American community relative to the Civil War? To understand this question, we need to not only see the outcomes of the Civil War, but we need to see how African Americans live prior to, during, and after the Civil War. Black people have been facing a harsh and cruel reality that has stemmed from the birth of the country and from slavery that was used to drive the nation forward. Originally, when the first settlers came to America, slavery was not thought of in the way it is today. Prior to slavery in America, it mostly targeted low-class individuals and prisoners who ultimately had some legal protections and rights such as marriage, or maybe even a path to freedom, such as in ancient Rome. Even when America started, its workforces consisted of white indentured servants who worked contracts guaranteeing them freedom and capital after a set amount of years, but this form was quickly phased out by African slaves who had no rights in comparison to their predecessors and thus were cheaper to care for. They were treated as property and had no legal claims to rights or even complaints against their masters. Although some of them were manumissioned by their masters or through service in the military, they still did not gain any political advantage as they were not allowed to vote and still faced the discrimination in society, and in some cases were re-enslaved if they were thought to be an escaped slave. This also occurred in the North because of the federal laws such as the Fugitive Slave Acts that superseded local policies and allowed slave patrols to legally police freedmen and hunt escaped slaves down. As the nation struggled with differences between economic and social policies regarding slaves in America, the North triumphed in their fight to liberate the slaves in what was the Civil War. As free African Americans and society were redefining their freedom, Southern legislators were quick to pass laws that went around the Emancipation Proclamation and both the 13th and the 14th Amendment as they tried to establish what they deemed normal prior to the Civil War by putting up the similar economic and social infrastructures under new names. These laws were vague individually but came to reach the same conclusions that were meant to be avoided in the first place. As freedmen were attempting to rebuild their lives, they came under attack by what we now know as the Black Codes. These Black Codes excluded race, but were clearly meant to be enforced on the newly freed slaves to reestablish the former power dynamic that treated them as property. Vagrancy and loitering was criminalized in order to keep African Americans suffering continued through some means of labor, whether by requiring not only to be employed, but to also carry a proof of employment, or else they would risk incarceration, where they would be made to work in prison, or would have a labor contract set up that forced them to work for a former slave owner and northern capitalists. This contributed to the stereotype that Black Americans were lazy if they were freed. Another claim made by the Union was that those that did not oppose the Union would be able to hold office in the aftermath of the Civil War. But after the death of Abraham Lincoln shortly after the end of the Civil War, Andrew Johnson allowed former Confederate officials to return to office. Meanwhile, they searched for new representatives to take office. An example of this would be Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of what would have been the Confederate States of America, and who held office as a Georgia governor despite the obvious conflicts of interest. The new convict leasing system was following the war was not only helped rebuild the indebted South through cheap labor, but was used to target freedmen because of the racial animosity that was failed to be addressed by the Reconstruction. The Black Codes were meant to police African Americans in society when around white people and to keep them in line. Even in constant caution, the laws were made in such a way that it targeted Black people for tedious activities, as the goal was to be able to imprison them and give them harsher sentences along with it. Once the freedmen were legally but unjustly imprisoned, they went back to a world of slavery that was renamed as convict leasing. As convicts, African Americans faced violence and abuse as they were leased out to private contractors by the state. Despite being freedmen outside of their judicial predicament and actually having a general idea of when they were to be released, they were seen as cheap and disposable labor that resulted in many deaths and were just maintained a life enough to work and but not enough to burn it back into the profits they generated. Because of alleged clerical errors, convicts were further imprisoned indefinitely as their paperwork was not in order and did not provide them an actual release date. A good attempt of reconstructing the South was the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established in 1865 by Congress to help the 4 million newly freed slaves adjust to society while also helping those impoverished by the Civil War. In its few short years, the agency helped to reconnect families displaced prior to and in result of the war. They provided necessities like food, clothing, and shelter while also teaching many freedmen to read and write. They also provided access to marriage, legal aid, land, and work contracts when available as they reached many ceilings in their endeavors. The end of the agency did not come due to a lack of failure of itself necessarily. It was rather due to a lack of funding and support of Southern white Americans who felt they were being cheated and stolen from by the people they had actually cheated and stolen from. In response to their oppression, African Americans were limited in their protest to the surroundings, since in slavery they risked death for disobedience, while as freemen they risked incarceration for being Black and ultimately die slaving away in a prison yard or in a chain gang as they try to survive their sentences. It is apparent that in those times, social movements for the advancement of African Americans were limited to violent means. Despite being enslaved, there were numerous slave uprising attempts in our history as African Americans risked everything in the name of justice. An infamous slave uprising was the 1831 Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia. Nat Turner was a slave who was seen as a bright individual and garnered such an influence that he assembled a group of 77 slaves to stand up to the community that controlled them and ended up massacring the surrounding area. After the horrific scene occurred, most people fled but were recaptured in the end and sentenced to death. The outcome of the rebellion was not so well thought out since they were recaptured, and it also went along to affect those in the surrounding area as they were thought to be in on the conspiracy and enabled harsher laws against slavery. The failure nonetheless lamented the misery of the slaves involved and their willingness to pursue freedom even when they are seen on the wrong side of the law. Nowadays, most people couldn't imagine having their rights infringed and would argue that voting for better solutions and candidates would be a great opportunity to get rid of those situations, but this was not always an option, for Black Americans at least. Despite gaining rights to vote, such as in 1870 when the 15th Amendment was ratified and gave Black men the right to vote, Black men still faced voter intimidation tactics that were meant to keep them away and voting for better situations. Black Americans were asked to provide poll taxes that accumulated if unpaid and inherently kept someone from voting for life. They were asked to perform literacy tests to determine whether they could vote, despite blatant laws that banned slaves from learning to read and write a few years prior. Another form of voter suppression that was used during the time of Reconstruction was the use of the grandfather clause that allowed people to vote and bypass all of the previous restrictions mentioned based on the valid voter status of their ancestors before 1895. These laws stand alone as a conservative but fair group of laws, but when taken into context, it is clear that separate but equal approaches were shams used to further the racial animosity in the nation. What steps can be taken to provide a true sense of equality in America for a successful Reconstruction? As we continue forward as a nation, we mustn't forget our history so as to not repeat it. It might not seem like oppression is impossible in the capacity it once was, but that doesn't mean it doesn't occur. The repercussions of Reconstruction still ring loud and clear, and you can choose to look for it, but as in the past, it is easy to turn a blind eye. Despite all the rules in place, now it doesn't mean that Black Americans still aren't facing a harsh reality in comparison to most Americans. Black Americans make up 13% of the overall population in the US, yet make up 40% of the prison population. Of those serving life sentences, that number jumps up to 48% of the prison population. Even Black Americans on probation make up 38% of the system. Outside of the prison, they are still more likely to come in contact with police as opposed to white Americans. This is not too far from the days of convict leasing, especially when you take into consideration the private prisons who profit from full prisons and the disenfranchisement of Black Americans in the process. Another way to overcome this situation is to support the movements out today. And a lot of the criticisms they face can also be can be seen as in earlier years where they were not allowed to peacefully protest, which in modern day America has been used to silence movements such as Black Lives Matter due to the pandemic and prioritizing the pandemic in certain situations, such as disenfranchising Black voters, but not when it comes to eating out at restaurants. It might seem easy to tear apart statements like defund the police, which are quite controversial, but when you look at the bigger picture and you realize what they actually stand for, those snappy slogans are used as clickbait to show people what's really happening in America and how we should actually fix the situation, such as when it comes to police brutality or the mass incarceration of Black Americans. Another way to support it, Black Solidarity, is to donate to groups that actually focus on this, and instead of just ignoring them or thinking that someone else will support it, actively supporting is what's going to make a change. Not being racist isn't enough. You have to be anti-racist, especially where in modern day America, people are still facing voter suppression, such as in Georgia, where the Wayne County is being scrutinized and attempted to have the votes there thrown out on the basis of mismatched signatures. This isn't too far from not necessarily literacy tests, but maybe poll taxes and other methods that were used to block people from the polls. Something meaningless and something that isn't being applied to everyone in the country. That is my presentation, and if there's any questions, I will take them now.
Awesome job. Thank you so much. We do have a live Q&A right now. So Christian, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. So if we have any questions right now, you can drop them in the chat, or just raise your hand and ask.
Oh, before I answer any questions, I wanted to mention in my presentation, I mentioned Wayne County, but that's actually in Michigan where that was taking place. A better example would have been Fulton County in Georgia.
Okay, good to know. Thank you for the clarification.
Yes.
So Christian, good to see you. Thanks for being here today and doing a great job. With the recent election of Joe Biden, we saw, how do you feel about the election in terms of improving Black Americans and their economics and their overall experience in this country? Are you hopeful, or are you feeling that, like many of the Reconstruction presidents, right after Lincoln, lives for Black Americans did not improve and did not get the bump that was hoped for by the radical Republicans? What are your thoughts here as you go into this administration? Are you hopeful? What's your emotion? What's your reaction?
I'm hopeful that it will make a change, and I do think it is a stepping stone in favor of Black Americans, but I wouldn't hold my breath just because I know in past experience or past elections, people do run on these promises that they tend not to keep. So far, when you're seeing the picks he's choosing for his cabinet, they seem to be great people, but I guess the actions they make in office is what's really going to make a change. Not necessarily who it is, but what they do. And also, I think it would just be great for there to be more representation of Black Americans without it necessarily being used to target Black Americans themselves. I feel like there's these claims of individualism, but then people try to use that as a way to get out of that.
Thank you, Christian.
All right, we have a question from the chat that asks, can you elaborate on defunding the police and explaining the impact this will have on racial equality?
Yeah. So when I mentioned defunding the police, I thought of the Freedmen's Bureau and basically of how they were seen as a social welfare agency, about how they help people. And I kind of thought that with the current debate, some people are actually claiming that instead of overburdening the police with tasks that they might not be using or tasks that aren't necessarily required for the police, we could send out social workers or possibly move funds around to places where it would actually help Americans. All right, thank you for the comment. Parissa? And is there any other questions?
I think I have one question. What was your favorite research? Like, what was your favorite source when researching this topic?
I guess when I was researching, mostly it was like the Library of Congress, but I think you do have to delve a little deeper and see more primary sources so you can get a firsthand account of what actually happened, because sometimes I feel like these stories get lost in academia. I think a good example would have been this one source that I used, which was the South Since the War, and it was basically a Northern reporter and his point of view going into the deconstructed South and how they were going about to fix things, and his, I guess, how his confrontations occurred with people that opposed him. And it kind of reminded me of people now and, like, let's say Trump supporters and people who may not support Trump.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, I have one question also. What do you think the federal government can do to influence local governments, especially in the South, who resist efforts at voter reform or prison reform?
I think that's definitely something that would get pushed more to the states, as America is a really like geopolitically different area, and in some places they might not push for that, as you might mention, and it just might depend. I guess having a tolerance for what is and isn't correct and knowing when the government should step in. I think something like that should be voter suppression, because we all vote regardless of where you are in the country. That is something definitely for the federal government to hand. And I have also personally worked election polls, so I know that there are federal agencies like the voter registration, or I forget what it's called, the ROV, registrar of voters, and they're the ones who handle the whole process here. And you just really see how bipartisan and how like clear everything is. And I don't know how else you could break it down more. I guess in places of interest, it's probably not being held the same way as it is here.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. And then is there any more questions?
There is one in the chat that says, I am curious, do you consider yourself a social activist since you mentioned a bit of activism and funding towards the end?
I would, but I personally am going to say I haven't like been out and about just because of the protest, but all or because of the pandemic. But aside from that, I recently had a child, and if not, I probably would be out there as well. But also I think I would consider myself a social activist because I don't think it's necessarily what you do or what you show in the world. It's just what you do on a day-to-day basis and how you interact with people, and what isn't seen.
Beautifully said, Christian.
Thank you.
All right, if that is all the questions we have, thank you so much, Christian. That was an awesome presentation.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we will go on to our last presentation of the day. And that is by Michelle Kim with Professor Sleeper on Tobacco, the Saving Grace of Jamestown.
I want to talk about tobacco and its influence and origins in Jamestown, and it is considered a saving grace for it because it saved it from a lot of economic ruin and really changed the state of the colony. So firstly, what is Jamestown? So Jamestown is most noted for being the first colony in the New World, and the New World is called so because the Western Hemisphere was previously undiscovered by the English. So the land was a mystery to the English and home to the indigenous people. They called it new because it's just simply something that they were not knowledged on. It was also started by the Virginia Company, who sponsored the starting of this. The Virginia Company sent some English colonists to Virginia to start up this Jamestown. They were looking for gold. Another big thing that we know is that the environment of Jamestown was really unfamiliar to these colonists. They were looking for gold, they just wanted profit, so they didn't really know exactly what they were in for just yet before going. So one big thing that we know that is very common knowledge is that Jamestown had a lot of deaths going on. And towards the beginning of Jamestown, there was a lot of economic failure and people were really struggling to make ends meet. So firstly, the environment is a huge part of this. Firstly, it was swampy, it was very humid, it was extremely hot, and the winters were just as extreme as how hot it was in the summer. There was also brackish water. Brackish water is basically when the water is saltier than fresh water, so it's not something that is very ideal to drink. And additionally, there were also droughts, which made farming and it was just difficult to get access to good water. And so some problems that they faced, climate, which was kind of a domino into a lot of other problems. So the climate also contributed to the spread of diseases. So first, one disease that it caused was dysentery. And dysentery is involved with digestion, and it's the infection of intestines which can result in severe diarrhea with the presence of blood and mucus in the feces. There was also typhoid, which is the lack of vitamin C, and it can have some pretty negative consequences on the body. And both of these had the side effects of anorexia, which was a huge reason why starvation was a big problem. And starvation is because there were a lack of preparations to find food, and it was overall pretty difficult to find ways to find fresh food. There was also some cases where people believe, well, it did happen, these colonists would resort to very desperate measures, and they would resort to cannibalism. And yeah, then there's the lack of peace that happened. So another reason why the death toll was so high was because Indians would often attack Jamestown settlers. And historians estimate that approximately 350 to 400 of the 1,200 settlers were killed. Peace between the Powhatan Indians and the English did not last long because there was an attempt to kidnap Pocahontas by the English in return for English prisoners and weapons that the Powhatan had held. So Jamestown was attacked by the Powhatan Indians for many years after, and they retaliated and fought with the Indians for many years to come. So with these conditions adding up, we can conclude that Jamestown was not an ideal place to live with its low survivability and little profit. Also, there's a lot of thinking that laziness was what killed the settlers. They thought that settlers were really lazy, too lazy to get their work done, but many claim that it's actually not exactly laziness. Their laziness is a side effect of one of the diseases that they went through. So writings show that malnutrition often led the colonists' death, as people that were victims of nutritional deficiency disease, which was very common, displayed signs of lethargy and anorexia. Victims would have too little energy to get up and act, and they insisted on staying idle in the comfort of their beds. This laziness was a symptom of malnutrition. Therefore, saying that colonists died from laziness is a bit too far of a jump, I believe. Historian Cooperman said that the word laziness comes up again and again, which is remarkable about Jamestown, is that a number of people are said to have died of laziness. So it wasn't exactly laziness, it was the idleness that was catalyzed by the malnutrition epidemic raging through Jamestown. Yeah, and like I said earlier, this anorexia was often a side effect of another underlying disease, like scurvy. Scurvy is by far the most identified disease that the colonists faced, which is caused by the lack of vitamin C, and yeah. So what really changed everything, what changed everything for the better, was the introduction of tobacco. So John Rolfe, he was sent to Jamestown on a new charter sent by the Virginia Company, and he is also credited with the saving of Jamestown. Here's this quote. Here, I'll go for it. Ralph Hammer. I may not forget the gentleman worthy of much recommendations, which first took the pains to make trial thereof, his name Mr. John Rolfe, Anno Domini 1612, partly for the love he hath a long time borne unto it, and partly to raise commodity to the adventures. That is Ralph Hammer, the Secretary of Virginia. So he credits John Rolfe for what he did, and he thinks that he's worthy of the praise for his actions. So what he did was that he basically introduced tobacco to Jamestown, and it is said that he found these seeds in the Caribbean, specifically Trinidad, and he also experimented with these seeds in the Jamestown environment. So based on his experience, he deducted that Jamestown was the perfect environment to grow the crop. So Jamestown was really marshy, swampy, humid, and so that was the very ideal environment, and he sent his first batch of tobacco that he grew to England, and it got a lot of positive reviews. So basically, he knew that Jamestown was in a rough situation. He saw that people were trying to make silk, glass, soap. All of these efforts, however, were never enough to pull a profit, and these would never be as successful as what the influence of tobacco would bring. And so here's a quote from John Rolfe himself. Likewise tobacco, which there thrives so well that no doubt but after a little more trial and experience in the curing thereof, it will compare with the best in the West Indies. So the sales. By 1630, over 1.5 million pounds of tobacco was exported from Jamestown annually. The success of tobacco made the economy greatly improved, since their slow beginnings in the colonists were finally able to make good profit for the Virginia Company, who had initially sent the colonists over to Virginia in hopes for good profit. So 50,000 pounds were sold to Spain alone, and there was just a lot of high demand for Jamestown-specific tobacco because it was just a really booming business, and it brought crazy economic success. So because there was so much of a demand for all of this tobacco, people really did need a good source of labor, and they wanted this labor to be accessible. They wanted it to be cheap. So Jamestown needed to produce more, which consequently resulted in the need for even more laborers. So the go-to source for labor was indentured servants, as they were seen as cheap labor. These indentured servants would work for plantation owners for 4 to 7 years, under the condition that the owners would pay for their trip to Virginia. When people saw the New World, they believed that they would be blessed with many more opportunities in terms of jobs, life, and wealth. However, it was a long trip, so some people could not afford to even pay the fees to travel from the United Kingdom to America. So people were willing to work as laborers for long hours and little pay just to travel. So African slaves were also widely used in the plantations as well. Indentured servants and slaves were treated with the same freedom opportunities at the time because slave laws didn't exist yet. Indentured servants often had to work in harsh conditions, constantly overworking themselves with little rest and long hours of work. So not only were conditions harsh, but the laborers were earning so little as their pay was very limited. For a while, indentured servitude is seen as a death trap because a good majority of them died before their contracts would even expire, so they wouldn't even be able to experience that freedom that they essentially worked so hard for. The mortality rates was extremely high. Masters were really cruel to their laborers, and this undoubtedly shaved off many years from their lives. Some servants would be severely beaten if they didn't meet their owner's standards, to the point that they would become disabled and they might even die. According to the historian Edmund Sears Morgan, Virginians began looking for, yearned for a cheaper, more docile, and more stable supply of labor, while their servants loafed on the job, ran away, and claimed the traditional long lunch hour. Eventually, indentured servants began to decrease in numbers as slaves became more abundant for lower prices. And by the middle of the 18th century, Africans became the main members of the labor force as the world's supply of slaves spiked in availability. And thank you for listening. That is my presentation.
All right, that was awesome. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. Michelle, you are signed up to do a live Q&A. Are you here?
Yeah, also sorry, my webcam, I don't really have a working webcam, so that's gonna be not working, sorry.
Totally fine. Do we have anyone that would like to start off the questions? Professor Sleeper, go ahead.
Thanks, Parisa. So Michelle, working with the 18th century and 17th century documents is not easy. What was the biggest challenge that you had with this research project?
So my biggest challenge personally was when I found primary sources. I honestly found it difficult to understand the language a little bit. So that was something that I had some struggles with. But I think by asking some other eyes to look at it as well, I was able to find the information that I think I needed.
Great. So beyond information, what do you think is the most important skill that you have learned in our course this semester? As opposed to like information, what was like the biggest skill that is your kind of biggest takeaway?
I guess my biggest takeaway would be like learning how to analyze documents and take away what might have been happening. I also learned about, I think, some documents that might have been like biased because I saw some articles saying cannibalism did happen, it was true, but then there were also some people at the same time that were saying no, they would never do that, that's not possible. So I had to kind of read through some of those papers and deduce what was really true.
Yeah, I really enjoyed working with you this semester, Michelle. Great job.
Thank you so much.
Parisa, go ahead.
I really enjoyed your presentation, Michelle. And I wanted to ask you if you could clarify something for me. When you were talking about indentured servants, were those the same thing as slaves, or were those separate, something else?
Oh, they were separate from slaves. Indentured servants were basically, they agreed to work under a contract. And then there's the whole slaves and African slaves going on.
I see. That's what I thought, but I just wanted to make sure. Also, I just want to say I had no idea that there was cannibalism going on in Jamestown, and maybe that's well-known information. But to me, that was really interesting because I didn't know. So I learned a lot from you.
Thank you.
I have a question from chat that asked who were calling the Jamestown colonists lazy? Was it people at the time, historians, or someone else?
From what I had heard, something that I learned a lot, like as a student, growing up in America, some of my teachers did tell me that they were lazy and they were portrayed as lazy. I do know that some people at the time who didn't know about the underlying diseases that may have caused laziness, they definitely thought that people in Jamestown were just like staying in bed and not doing their work. But as modern science, started proving that laziness might have happened because of anorexia and all of the diseases happening, I think that idea started fading away a bit.
Go ahead, Parisa.
So I don't know much about tobacco, honestly, but I think it's considered addictive. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is it? Okay, Robert is nodding his head. So do you know if it had any negative side effects on Jamestown and maybe people becoming addicted or anything negative like that?
I honestly didn't read anything about the fact that it might be addictive to them. I personally kind of want to do some research on that. But I do know that, tobacco today, everybody knows that there's nicotine and it's really addictive. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any any drugs or anything like that, but thank you. That would be interesting to research.
Yeah.
I have a question. Did Jamestown over time just rely on tobacco, or did they diversify their resources, so to speak, for export?
Well, I think that tobacco really got the ball rolling for Jamestown. Eventually, they did spread out to modern exports. It's just that the reason why tobacco was such a turning point was because before the introduction of tobacco, the Jamestown settlers were just in such a bad position. So I think tobacco
was really a starting thing that brought so much success to a place that was so deep in the negative.
Great, thank you.
I am curious about what kind of brought you to this research topic. What made you want to study this?
So I kind of wanted to study this because we went over it in Professor Sleeper's class. We went over tobacco and its influence on Jamestown a bit, and I found it pretty interesting, and I wanted to know more. So I did like a little bit of more research on it on my own, and then it turns out we had this project, so I just decided to use it.
All right, that's awesome. Do we have any more questions for Michelle? All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Michelle. That was an awesome presentation. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
That was our last one of the day. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We do have 2 more days on Thursday and Friday of our OMNI presentations. And you were sent those links earlier this week. Professor Sleeper, do you have anything else you want to say?
Thanks, Christine. I just want to say thank you again to Dan and Maddie and Christian and Michelle. When the students show up to do the live Q&A, it does add so much, as Parisa added to her presentation earlier. So it's not required this year. It will be in the spring, but I just want to say to make that extra effort to come here today. I do know it's not always easy to do public speaking. I struggle with it, especially in this medium as well, but you showed up today. You did a great job, and I'm very grateful for all 4 of you coming and making this this session really valuable. Thank you.
All right, thank you,
That's
everyone. Okay, thank you, everyone. And amazing job to all of our presenters. And for everyone else, have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for coming.
Great job, Christine, also.
Thank you.
You did it, Christine. You did a wonderful job. I just want to say